A massive shout out to the Jonin tier member Mr. Leroy 1998 and Jenin tier Leah Rov. Your support means a lot. If you would like your name mentioned in every video, support the channel, as well as receive special perks and access exclusive series, consider becoming a member of this channel by hitting that join button. Hi guys, this is the final part of What If Natsu Was the Son of Acnologia? I hope you enjoy. Acnologia looked at the gathered dragons, eyes studying the faces quickly before they flickered to the orb above the tower. The thing was still pulsing with barely constrained energy, but it was not shaking the whole island. The four kings could do little about it, their probing too superficial to give any results, but they ran out of time before Acnologia and the other three managed to figure out what to do with it. A shriek sounded behind him, far in the distance. The king took a deep breath, eyes moving away from the bright gold and back to the dragon standing in the early night. He turned around, staring into the darkness of the night before he spread his wings, claws scraping against the rock on the edge. Behind him, the dragons rose into the air, not a sound leaving the numerous throats. He pushed off of the edge, diving into the open sky before twisting and facing the dragons. His dragons, his army. Behind me is an army of demons, he spoke, voice barely louder than usual but every ear heard him. But in front of me is an army as well. No armies the likes of these clashed in eons. His blue eyes passed over the sky, the sounds of thunder that so many wings created mixed with the ever-approaching shrieks. You all know what's at stake, he was talking louder now. Not just the existence of humans and animals, not just dragons. The fate of the world, of reality, is in our claws. That's what at stake. The demons have forgotten what it's like to fight a dragon. We will remind them to fear. They are trying to reach the blade. We will not let them. We are the dragon kind. The first warriors. Show them what it means. Send them back to hell. He roared, loud and clear and angry, and the dragons responded in kind, the very island shaking from the force. He twisted in the air, turning towards the now clearly visible shapes of the demons. The sky exploded in bright lights, the roars turning to magic. Don't die, Acnologia, Igneel shouted as he dived beside him, flying away and into the rows of the demons. Don't die either, old bastard. That's a direct order from your king, the Dragon King responded before he dived, magic exploding around him. He eyed a group of demons, moving towards one of the smaller dragons. It turned its long snout toward the Dragon Slayer, old but sharp red eyes eyeing the Dragon Slayer. You are getting too careless, my apprentice. The white-haired Dragon Slayer frowned. I did not die, master. Isn't that what matters? I am not talking about your life, for I know it was not in any greater danger than of any other mortal in this battle. I am talking about the attacks that missed, those that hit your comrades. The old one was not pleased. Acnologia shook his head to clear it of the memory, roaring in response and tearing through the demons. Through the collapsed floor, Lily glowing with golden seals and a demon grinning from ear to ear. He was upon the demon before even he fully registered that he was moving, and he slammed into him, lightning propelling the demon even further away. He snarled at the demon, face twisted in a furious scowl while the other grimaced, picking himself out of the rubble. The lightning mage glanced over his shoulder towards Lily. The cat lied on the ground, his other form lying prone and unmoving, golden seals covering half of his body. For a moment Laxus thought the cat was dead, but then he caught his eyes. Brown eyes stared back at him, tears trickling down the side of his face, and for a brief moment, the cat smiled. Laxus stared, unable to truly process what he was seeing before the light on the seals turned white and he was thrown back by the shockwave of another explosion. He slammed into a wall, eyes flying wide as the heat washed over him and something wet splattered his face and hands. Lily. The explosion died down and Laxus blinked at the blood that seemingly coated the entire wall the cat had lied against. There was so much of it. It trailed down the wall and Laxus stared at the slow trickles, feeling completely detached from the scene. That was rude, the demon spoke behind him, and Laxus' eyes flew away from the wall, right before he managed to force himself to look down at what no doubt had been the body. Interrupting my fun like that, the demon continued, and Laxus stared at him, something about him familiar. It didn't matter, the Dragon Slayer decided easily enough, moving once again as a lightning-coated fist slammed into the demon before he could respond. You, the lightning mage growled through gritted teeth as he slammed another fist into the demon, will pay. Doesn't matter, the Dragon Slayer snarled, lightning exploding around him. As long as I can move one muscle in my body I will fight. I will not lose to a fucking human. You already lost. Dragon Slayer's secret art. Jackal glared back, fingers moving as the beginnings of his seals spread around them. What the fuck are you? Roaring thunder. The sky split in half as a bolt of thunder struck the ground where Laxus and Jackal stood, obliterating what was left of the ceiling above them. The demon screeched, wide eyes staring at Laxus as his muscles spasmed and locked, his large form forced to stay in one spot as the thunder burned him alive. Laxus stared at the charred remains of the demon, blackened face frozen and twisted in pain. I am a fairy tale wizard. With the adrenaline gone, the exhaustion hit him like a train. He stumbled back, eyes falling shut for a brief moment only for him to blink them open as he found himself on the ground, eyes staring at the concerned faces of Carla and Happy. Laxus, Happy all but jumped onto him and the Dragon Slayer tried to sit up only for the pain to shot through him and almost make him cry out. Don't move, Carla needlessly advised and the Dragon Slayer suddenly realized the two cats were sobbing. Laxus blinked, looking around. The three mages that the cats were protecting before he arrived were lying next to him and he couldn't help but stare at them. They did not look good. What's going on? He grunted, staring at the two cats. His eyes fell on a familiar red sword, embedded into the ground a few feet away from them. Where is Lily? Is he? Happy bit down hard on his lower lip, looking at the ground and Carla looked away, head nodding towards the corner of the room. Laxus' head snapped to the side, to the scarlet wall and the somewhat dried blood. Bile rose in his throat at the sight. The headless corpse was torn to pieces, one side almost completely missing from the rest of the body, the half of the head lying in its own pool of blood some distance away. He looked away quickly but it didn't help, the image already burned into his eyelids. I was too late. Happy glanced at him, small paw hesitantly reaching to touch his shoulder. It's not your fault. Carla nodded, it's all Tartaros' fault. Everything. Laxus stared at the two cats, the edges of his vision already turning black. They were not safe here. Not with this many injured members and only the two cats to protect them. He can't lose consciousness now. The black spread and the voices became distant. He simply can't. Laxus, Laxus. Carla pulled at his shoulder and Happy turned to look at her, vision blurred because of tears. What are we going to do, Carla? The white cat swallowed, shaking her head. I don't know. We can't stay here, she continued, staring at the pale faces in front of them. Lily never told us where Altair and Lizana are. One of us should go to Natsu and, well, we can only hope that no one from Tartaros finds us here. Happy bit his lower lip, nodding. Lily was the only one who could fight, without him. Carla nodded and the two fell silent for a moment. You go and get Natsu, Happy. But, you're faster than me, I'll try to do something. What if someone finds you before we get back? The blue cat looked reluctantly at Carla even as the white wings spread behind him. Carla swallowed again, a lump in her throat refusing to leave. They won't. Happy paused at the conviction in her voice and he wasn't sure if it was because she saw it or because she had to believe it. But he will have to believe it as well. There wasn't much choice. He nodded, leaping into the air and disappearing in a blur of blue and white. I wanted to end it all, Silver whispered, grimacing in pain as he sat on the frozen ground. Gray stared at him, eyes wide and hurt. And entrust everything to you. Tears pricked the corner of his son's eyes and the demon slayer turned his eyes back to the frozen ground, waiting for the inevitable anger. How dare you? You did all this, to make me overcome my nightmare, the teen said through gritted teeth, clenched fist shaking at his side. The ice mage swallowed, staring at his father who refused to meet his eyes. How selfish can you be? Silver blinked, daring to look into his son's furious eyes. After all these years, after attacking me and my friends, forcing me to go through my darkest memories again, now you ask me to kill you. And you call it a favor? The ice mage glared at him and Silver looked away, shame burning in his gut. Do you have any idea what you are asking me to do? I hate you. I fucking hate you. The mage paused and the slayer dared another glance at the hurt look mixed with fury etched on his son's face. Then please, just end it. End me. Gray looked ready to throw something, scowling fiercely at him. Don't you get it? I can't kill my own father. Silver blinked, eyes lifting to look at his son. A smile lifted the corner of his lips and he pushed himself to his feet. That's what makes you human. Gray stood frozen in spot, eyes wide as he watched the demon slayer who was smiling gently at him. His father. His dead father. A tear leaked down his cheek and he stumbled forwards first 2 steps, and by the third, he was already standing next to him. He tensed again, not sure what to do as he looked at the larger man, searching his face for any sign of the man he used to be. And he found it, because this was his father, and no matter how much he hated him, he still loved him. The demon slayer spread his hands slightly, not sure if that was the right thing to do, but his son collapsed against his chest, fists twisting into the black fabric of his shirt. Silver smiled again, sad, mournful expression as he wrapped his hands around the smaller teen. How many times did he dream of seeing his father again? How many times did he dream of seeing his son again? And here they are. For just a brief moment Gray managed to pretend he was not hugging a corpse. For just a brief moment, he could pretend that Deliora never happened. "I am so proud of you," Silver whispered, and the sound of his voice broke through the haze that settled over Gray's mind, and the ice mage blinked, wiping the tears out of his face. "This isn't fair." The teen expected some empty platitudes of, "It will be alright," some overused lines of, "Life isn't fair." His father nodded instead, a tear trailing down his own cheek. "It isn't." And just like that, he disappeared. Gray stared at the flickering light, hand halfway up to reach for the warmth of his father's touch before he forcefully pushed his hand down, moving it to his face. "I am so very proud of you, Gray." The ice mage looked up at the still flickering lights, his father's voice coming to him like a whisper in the wind. "That is why I am passing this on to you. I believe in you and I know that you can do it." Gray swallowed. "Do what?" "Kill E.N.D. That was my mission. And now my legacy." "E.N.D." The light flickered out, not even a trace of it left. "Father." Gray swallowed, but the thick lump in his throat refused to move. "Rest in peace, Father. You deserve it, you bast." He choked on a sob, not able to finish the sentence. Tempester swallowed, staring at him through the black spots in his vision. "Maybe, but you are too late. The blade of Anxeram is closer with every passing second and our army is moments away." Natsu paused, the grip on the demon's wrist tightening, magic leaking from his form, and burning the demon beneath him like acid. "Where is it?" Tempester grunted in pain, eyes squeezing shut. "Where is it?" Something cold twisted in Tempester's gut and the words tumbled out of his mouth, almost as if dragged out of him. "The D-Dragon Island." Natsu froze, eyes widening. "Our army is moments away." Tempester watched from his down position, dark blue eyes staring at bright red. The dragon looked on the verge of a frenzy, walking on the line between sanity and madness. Natsu moved before Tempester managed to so much as twitch, gripping the side of his head with enough force that Tempester could feel his skull cracking. The dragon locked eyes with the demon one last time, a furious look in his eyes which made the demon freeze. "Burn in hell where you belong." Before Tempester could truly process the parting words, the dragon jerked his hands, twisting his neck completely to the other side before he pulled and twisted it again, tearing the head of the corpse off of the neck. Black blood sprouted from the neck, spraying a good portion of his face and right side of his chest. Natsu jumped back to the upper floor a moment later, moving towards Gajeel, who stared back, looking rather wary of the dragon. Natsu stared at him for a moment, face completely and disturbingly blank. The dragon slayer nearly jumped out of his skin when the dragon kneeled beside him suddenly, fingers pressing against the broken bone. The dragon slayer yelped, twisting out of the offending digits, but Natsu gripped his knee tightly enough for the dragon slayer to grimace. He did calm down, though. "Calm down," the dragon snarled, and Gajeel swallowed. "I'm trying to see if the bone is broken or just." He stopped, turning to look back towards the hole in the floor where Tempester's corpse lied. His eyes widened at the black particles that were filling the air. Gajeel cursed, "The particles. This is how the guy got Laxus." Natsu stood up, staring at the darkening surroundings, one hand over his nose and mouth. Not that it would help much, he knew. Before he could even begin to contemplate how to deal with them, however, the black flickered and the air turned frigid. "Silver." The dragon turned on his heel towards the familiar scent, ignoring the suddenly frozen particles. Only to see Gray standing there, face calm but eyes furious. The dragon felt himself relax, relieved at seeing the ice mage relatively unharmed after assuming the worst. The relief was turned to wariness as he focused, once again brain moving to the reason why he mistook him for Silver in the first place. His scent changed, the magic he used to freeze the particles in an instant. "Who are you? If you want to kill E.N.D, well, here I am." The two stared, completely and utterly shocked. Gajeel swallowed. That's not funny, Soul Eater. It's not, Natsu agreed, red eyes staring into Gray's wide dark blue ones. Gray felt like someone pulled the floor right from under him for the umpteenth time that day. This couldn't be right, not even half an hour ago he promised his father that he would kill E.N.D. And now E.N.D turned out to be Natsu. He gave a wordless cry, rushing at the dragon before he even truly understood what he was doing. Ice Devil's Fang, his fist slammed into the dragon who didn't even seem to bother with dodging. He moved to pull his ice-coated fist back only to find it in a vice-like grip of the dragon. He blinked, eyes widening in horror as he looked at the black bruise already forming on the dragon's shoulder. He jerked back, stumbling as the dragon released the hold on his wrist. He couldn't kill Natsu, even if he was strong enough, which he knew he wasn't, he couldn't. This day couldn't get any worse. The dragon had to take a breath, forcing down his rising ire. He couldn't really blame the mage for what he did. The fact that he backed off when he started thinking a bit more logically said enough to the dragon. The horror at what he did clear in his eyes. The guilt. Natsu wasn't sure how he would respond in such a situation. He didn't really want to know. He knew that heads would be rolling most likely. How? The ice mage barely seemed to register that he even asked something. Natsu didn't care much. He deserved to know. They all did. It was definitely not how he envisioned telling them, though. He didn't really plan on telling them at all, truth to be told. But the cat was out of the bag and leaving it at this would only make things worse. Anxeram told me. I have died twice already. The first time I died Zeref brought me back, and in the process of doing that he created E.N.D. Me. A part of me. I don't even know. I am E.N.D but E.N.D is not me, if that makes any sense. He paused and fought back a wince at how awkward that sounded. Surprisingly enough, it was enough for the two. Gajeel snorted again. Next thing I know, you'll tell me something like, Acnologia is Urz's father. The dragon prince looked back at the ice mage. Gray stared at the ground, dark blue eyes clouded in turmoil and shining with unshed tears. Natsu blinked in surprise, not sure what to say, and so, he stayed silent, waiting for the mage to finish. I am so sorry. A tear trailed down Gray's cheek and he quickly brushed it away with the back of his hand, turning his head even further to the ground to hide his face behind his hair. The dragon was never good with emotional situations. He was awkward at the best of times. But the whole day was enough of an emotional roller coaster for him that he felt drained enough to not particularly care for appearances anymore. And he was angry enough at Tartaros that he couldn't really bring himself to properly be annoyed about the bruise that was already healing. Everyone reached a boiling point where they needed to lash out. Natsu understood that far better than he would like to admit. And the mage was obviously sorry. He was eating himself up over it. It's alright, and surprisingly, it really was. Gray blinked, obviously not expecting that easy acceptance. Why? Natsu sighed, pulling out something red and round out of his pocket. Just give me a minute and I'll answer anything you want. What is that? Gajeel asked, staring at the orb that smelled familiar. A war horn, Natsu said, turning the small scarlet orb in his fingers. Tempester told me that the floating island is under attack, or will be. Every dragon on the continent will know about it if I break this. And they will come. What's on the island that's so important? Natsu looked at the two, fingers closing around the orb. The blade of Anxeram. The orb shattered, the scarlet dust flying into the wind, and the dragon prince spoke. Every dragon is to return to the palace of Dova immediately. The demon army is marching towards it if it isn't already there. I repeat, every dragon is to return to the palace of Dova immediately. He fell silent, turning to look at the two. You are taking this rather well. Gajeel shrugged. I'm still pretty sure I'm in shock. But hey, you're still you. And that's enough for me. Gray stayed silent, eyes dry, and face surprisingly closed off. We should try finding the others, the Devil Slayer finally spoke, and Natsu nodded in agreement. You don't have any questions? I have, a lot of them, the ice mage admitted easily. I'll save them for later. I'm not the only one who lost someone today. I'm sorry. Natsu paused, turning around once again to look at the mage in a well-hidden surprise. He nodded after a moment. Nothing more needed to be said. The three stayed silent for a moment after that, each uncertain or unwilling to say anything, when the relative silence was broken by one flying blue cat. Natsu. To Zeref. The Dragon King twisted, slamming his tail into her side. She coughed, black blood mixing with spittle, but before she was sent flying away completely, her fingers enlengthened, green energy dancing down their length, and she wrapped them around the king's tail. Pain. Acnologia's only response was a growl, his teeth snapping at her, and forcing her to move back. She stumbled as she hit the ground, glaring at him. You may be a dragon, but I am an Aetherius. A demon of Tartaros. I will fulfill Lord Mardgeir's wishes. Acnologia blinked, silent for a brief moment before he bared his teeth in a mockery of a smile. I am Dragon King Acnologia, demon. All you will succeed in today is dying. He watched as her blue eyes narrowed, a scowl on her face, but the look of terror in her eyes did not escape his notice. You are his father. She didn't manage to finish, the Dragon King moving far faster than his size would suggest as he moved his tail towards her. She dodged by jumping into the air, something that proved a fatal mistake a moment later as the king brought down his hand, claws piercing down the length of her torso, and pinning her into the ground as he slammed his claws into the dirt. I take it you met Natsu. The demon stared up at him, blue eyes wide and blood dripping down her chin. She breathed in shakily and a flicker of magic ran down the length of Acnologia's fingers. Damn you, she whispered, azure staring into sky blue, and in response, Acnologia's fist blazed in chaos magic. He pulled back his fist, claws coming back black with blood, and he jerked the claws, ready to take back into the air now that the would-be infiltrator was taken care of. Only to freeze as the blood stopped falling to the ground midair and the deafening noise of the battle disappeared. He looked around, eyes wide. Everything stood frozen, as if. Just as Natsu, I see, the Dragon King's eyes widened even further before they narrowed, and he turned around, roar already bursting from his jaw towards the immortal that jumped out of the way as if it was nothing. Zeref landed lightly on his feet, hands clasped behind his back as he eyed the Dragon King. Must be your affinity to chaos. You and Natsu are the only ones who are not affected by this spell. Zeref, the black wizard, smiled gently, inclining his head. Acnologia, Natsu, the three fairy tale members raised their heads with a snap, eyes locking on the flying feline seconds before it crashed straight into the Dragon Prince. Natsu's hand shot out on instinct, snatching the cat's wing before he made contact and holding him inches from his chest. Happy. What? No time. Mira, Altair and Lisanna are in danger. Myra's hurt. I. Natsu's eyes widened, worry squeezing his throat shut for a moment before anger pushed through and he shook the poor cat in his grip. Lips pulled back over his teeth, all sharp and pointed, and he snarled, where? I don't know where Lisanna and Altair are. Lily came with Mira and he knew where they were, but. Where's Lily? Gajeel asked, voice quiet and eyes wide. His mind immediately went to the worst possible scenario, but he tried to force the thoughts away. There was no way that Jackal K killed him. Happy was sobbing now and Natsu let go of him, blinking in shock. He shook himself, flinching as something unknown and alien washed over him, and he jerked his head to Grey and the shell-shocked Gajeel. And no, the Dragon Slayer whispered, corner of his lips trembling. You know where Mira is? Natsu demanded of the cat, every word clipped and just short of snarled. Happy swallowed, large eyes fixed on the dragon as he nodded. Good, take these two there, the Dragon Prince growled, already moving. I'll try to find Altair and Lisanna. He paused a second before he disappeared behind the corner, red eyes fixing on the three fairy tale members, and his eyes seemed to say something but his mouth remained closed and he disappeared, breaking out into a sprint without any warning or preparation. Grey swallowed, the heavy silence that settled over them left his ears ringing. He glanced at Gajeel, biting his lower lip. The Iron Dragon Slayer was staring at his shaking hands, tears streaking down his ashen face. For a brief moment, Grey considered empty platitudes, but, in the end, he didn't say anything. There was nothing anyone could say that would fix this. Let's go, the Ice Mage said instead, turning to look at Happy. When no one moved, Grey sighed and turned to the cat. Happy, the cat responded to his name, his head snapping towards the ice user. Gajeel's leg is broken, so if you could. Happy blinked, turning to look at Gajeel, who was shaking his head that was dropped in his hands, fingers gripping his hair. For fuck's sake, the Iron Dragon Slayer gasped, slamming his head into the ground, fucking demons. Natsu always prided himself on being able to keep his cool, on being able to keep his thoughts and actions logical even in those rare moments where his emotions reached a boiling point. What he witnessed at that moment, however, made him lose any sense of calm. He didn't reach a boiling point. He went beyond that. A red mist settled over his mind and tinged his entire surroundings in 2 bright colors and 2 dark shadows. And all his terrifying, furious focus settled on Mardgeir. Mardgeir, who stood above Altair that barely looked like herself. He felt sick and angry and perfectly ready to break every bone in the demon's body and then feed him his organs. What they did to Altair, the demonized time mage, was bleeding from dozen cuts, and her body was a discolored mess of bruises and gashes and burns. But she was still awake, and her eyes, a solid purple, looking almost like an insect's, stared straight at him with a look of sudden elation and hope just as Mardgeir placed his heel on her chest and something in her snapped, making her scream. The demon must have noticed that Altair's attention was not on him anymore, and he looked up, eyes widening almost comically as the red eyes of the dragon prince suddenly appeared not even 10 inches away from his face. Natsu wasted no second, slamming his fist coated in red and black magic into the demon's jaw. The jaw shattered upon impact, and the demon released a surprised shout, completely and utterly unprepared for the strength behind the punch. Lifted clean off of his feet, his movement limited, he was vulnerable to the dragon prince, who jumped after him, slamming with both feet into the demon's stomach and driving them both straight through the floor and into a large chamber underneath. Natsu's knees bent as he absorbed the impact with the floor below, keeping his balance atop the self-proclaimed Demon King, and his hands were already lit with chaos energy. Chaos Dragon King's Destruction Fist. He slammed his fist straight into the demon's wide-eyed face, the chaos energy exploding around them both and shooting into the air. The black and red of the magic seemingly bubbled, suspended in the air before it exploded, turning the stone around them to dust. The dust and light of the spell blinded everyone, and the sound of the explosion deafened him enough that when a fist moved to slam into the side of his face, Natsu didn't even have time to react. The strength behind the punch sent him flying off of the demon underneath, and he spun through the air, head over heels before he hit the ground, managing to roll onto his feet with barely enough time to move out of the way of a vine that erupted from the wall and embedded into the ground. He twisted, magic flaring around him and bleeding from black to red before it exploded around him, turning the vines that moved around him to ash. Mardgeir was already upon him, eyes wide with anger as he drew his fist into the dragon's jaw. The dragon skidded back but didn't lose his footing, red and black still pulsing around him, and Mardgeir hissed as he jumped back, rubbing his knuckles with a scowl as he glanced at the bones that were peeking through the scorched skin. "I was not aware your magic generated so much heat," the demon spoke, looking at the dragon, who in response raised his hand and pointed it at the demon. Mardgeir's eyes widened and he jumped aside as a pillar of a red and black shot past him. "Neither was I," Natsu muttered, spitting out the blood that came from biting his tongue when Mardgeir's fist connected with his jaw. He didn't pause in his stride, and as the Mardgeir landed from his dodge, the dragon was already there, driving his elbow into the demon's stomach. Chaos Dragon's Chaotic Elbow. Mardgeir coughed, black blood splattering from his mouth, and his feet left the ground, red and black magic driving deep into his stomach. He landed in a crunch, wiping the blood off of his chin with the back of his hand. "You are strong, Soul Eater. But you are still nothing in the face of an Aetherius. In the face of my true form." He stood up, eyes still wide with a look bordering on insane, bow before the underworld king Mardgeir Tartaros. His curse exploded around him, wrapping its dark tendrils around his form. "Zeref, Acnologia, I won't even ask what you want," the Dragon King snarled, jerking his head in the general direction of the golden orb still floating above the ruined tower of the castle. "You are a fool for even thinking I will allow you to activate the key." Zeref smiled simply, cocking his head to the side. "Don't you think you could allow me to touch it? Just one small touch." Acnologia's eyes narrowed. "Over my dead body?" Zeref clicked with his tongue, shifting the weight of his body to 1 foot, so dramatic. In a blink of an eye, the black wizard disappeared, moving at the speed no normal being could follow. Acnologia was far from normal, and his tail struck out, colliding with Zeref, who grabbed it and flipped over it at the last second, pushing away when magic exploded down its length. Acnologia snarled again, twisting in sync with the black wizard, and he opened his jaw, Chaos Dragon's Roar. Zeref disappeared, flickering out of the view in a black flash. Acnologia cursed, disappearing as well and reappearing inches away from the golden orb, claws just barely dragging across Zeref's back in time to push the wizard away from the key, his fingers inches from touching it. Acnologia growled at him, magic sparking down the length of his claws. Zeref grimaced as he was sent flying away, but the black wizard barely even crossed a few feet before he once again flickered out of view and disappeared through the void. Acnologia growled again, blue eyes flickering around the frozen sky before his nose caught the faint trace of ozone that erupted from an opening of the void. He ripped the hole in the sky, flying through the void and meeting the black wizard on the other side just in time to push him away from the hellish contraption again. Zeref made an annoyed sound in the back of his throat, red eyes staring at the Dragon King dryly, and Acnologia almost flinched. It was easy to forget that Natsu and Zeref were brothers with how little they looked alike. But those eyes, now red on Zeref as well, were identical, and it was unnerving. "You are only delaying the inevitable," Zeref informed him, sounding almost apologetic. "The age of humans and dragons is over. The age of demons." Acnologia didn't let him finish, never being the one to listen to the monologues that seemed to be a character trait of all things evil, and he will forever deny that he tended to do them as well, let alone acknowledge that he might do it still. He pushed through the air again, claws wrapped in chaos energy, and Zeref disappeared again, flickering away. "Go back to your hole and stay there. You are not getting what you want, and neither is Anxeram." Acnologia blinked, looking around, listening, but Zeref seemed to disappear. He didn't know how loud the battle was until the sound returned and hit him like a tsunami. He faltered in the sky, wings missing a beat as everything returned at once and made his ears ring. Barely a second of distraction, barely slower than usual. Just barely, but enough. The whole world seemed to lurch sideways for one terrifying moment, the very sky shaking as the moon turned blood red and then disappeared completely, in its place a giant black hole and a clear view into a place Acnologia hoped to never see again. Blue eyes darted from the hole and towards the blade of Anxeram. The golden orb was gone, and Zeref stood at the edge of the ruined tower where it had once floated, a golden sword shaped almost like a key grasped tightly in his hand. The black wizard gave the Dragon King a small smile that held no happiness, closed his black eyes, and disappeared in a flicker of black light. Acnologia swallowed, first turning to look at the battle in the sky that came to a sudden halt, and then towards the hole that seemed to only grow larger, and towards the demons that from this distance looked more like ants that dropped from the hole like rain. Asinine questions. "I'm going to kill you, and you should be glad I am more concerned about finding my family," and he wondered if that included fairy tale as a whole for a brief second before he decided that, yes, it did. He looked at the purple eyes that still seemed far too smug for his liking. "Why, you are too late." Natsu stared at him for a silent moment before he gave the demon a smile of his own, and he could see the way the demon shifted. "You failed, Mardgeir Tartaros. You will never see Zeref. You will never see your god. Die with the knowledge that you were deemed unworthy by Aetherius Natsu Dragneel." Mardgeir's eyes widened, a flicker of shock and disbelief, and he rasped, "Impossible." Natsu cocked his head to the side, smile widening as he wrapped his finger around the demon's throat. "Why will lose, Chaos Dragon's grip strike." The demon's death brought him little satisfaction, not for some noble reason or for some revenge isn't an answer, but for the simple fact that it was too fast. Too painless. But it was a gory death. And that will have to be enough, Natsu decided as he turned on his heel away from the headless corpse. He needed to. The world lurched in its place and the sky flashed red. And then the light disappeared and the hell opened. "Sometimes I wonder, about what exactly, dear Hades? Is he stupid or just mad? Morrigan, I wonder if he is stupid or mad." Morrigan paused, fingers motionless over a raven she was stroking, and the bird blinked its 3 red eyes at her before it disappeared in a puff of smoke. The goddess smirked and turned her bird-like eyes towards the blue-haired god. "And he can't be both. You are surprisingly calm considering what Anxeram is doing," Verstuck noted, cleaning his nails. "Same could be said for you," Minerva spoke with a note of disdain in her voice, pausing in her pacing to glare at the gods sitting on the plush velvet chairs as if there was not another great war brewing. "Anxeram alone cannot start a great war, Minerva," Hades told her. "Shame, really," came a muttered reply from Anubis. The jackal-faced god was sprawled across a pile of pillows. "But he is right. Anxeram, whatever happens, will either have his fun or the Haven bastards are going to send him back here with his tail between his legs. No one wants another war, and it will not happen. Sure, few mortals died and a few more will, but as long as we stay here no one will so much as blink. And you can't pretend like we didn't know he was doing this. He's been preparing for this for the last 400 years, Satan added. Minerva rolled her eyes as she sat down, another chair appearing underneath her at a wave of her hand. "Well, true as that may be, I did not expect that he would succeed." "I don't think anyone did," at least not so soon. "'Tis true," Morrigan said, "but humans can be surprising." Speaking of humans, Hades smirked, bringing his index and middle finger together for a brief moment and twisting them to the side. A well-known face appeared in front of them and the Morrigan rolled her eyes, eyeing the other demon god. "You can't be serious." A smirk appeared on Hades' face. "You are serious. Acnologia will murder him, obviously. If not him then his cursed brat." "Our cursed brat," Anubis cackled, propping himself up into a sitting position. "I take it we're taking bets." "Obviously," Minerva sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. She spoke after a moment, "You're all acting like brats," and a second later she added, "100 souls on Acnologia." White eyes in a shadowy face curved into a smile as the air in front of him bubbled and tore. The wind ruffled his clothing, the air from the other world mixing with the stale sulfuric smell of Castle Hell. How long has it been since he breathed in this air? A white line split his face, mouth moving into a dangerous grin. "Glorious." The demon beside him glanced at him, red eyes wide with shock and awe, and Lilith nodded. "You did it, sire." Anxeram grinned. "Of course, I did. You didn't doubt me, did you, my dear Lilith?" A small smile crossed her lips, a fond look on her face as she looked at the ground below as the portal opened completely and the army behind them started pouring out of it. "Never, sire." Green eyes blinked open, the movement lost in the darkness. A small trickle of bluish light came from somewhere to his right and he turned his head, ignoring how much a simple movement like that hurt. Everything hurt, something he became more and more aware of as the numbness faded away. He grimaced, clenching one fist that he could feel against the hard floor as he finally managed to focus on the blue crystal that was emitting the weak light. What is going on?" The black-haired guy looked up and, in the darkness, it took him a moment to recognize Gray. "Arthur." Arthur blinked in response, not sure what to say to that. The ice mage looked dead on his feet and with the cobwebs slowly moving out of his mind Arthur was able to see that the two were not alone. Wendy, Mira, and Laxus lied beside him, bunched up clothes that he realized mostly came from Gray under their heads. Happy and Carla have huddled together a bit further away, asleep or unconscious as well, and Gajeel sat beside them, head resting on the wall behind him, but his eyes were open as the Dragon Slayer stared in front of him, looking like he didn't see much at all. "What happened?" Arthur asked again, blinking one more time and trying to clear his head. Gray grimaced, looking at the sky for a moment, and Arthur followed his line of sight, eyes stopping on the black sky and the giant hole. "No, it can't be." "It is," Gray grimaced, falling silent for a moment before he continued, "Before you ask, no, I don't know where anyone else is or if everyone here is okay." Arthur blinked, trying to sit up only for vertigo to hit him, and he collapsed back, almost puking. "You shouldn't move, Junior," Gajeel's raspy voice echoed in the small room they were occupying. "You lost a lot of blood. Frankly, I'm surprised you're not dead yet." "Yet," Arthur swallowed, looking at himself and grimacing at the missing arm. The stump was encased in ice and he was not a doctor, but he was not sure that was a good idea in the long run. But it did stop the bleeding better than clothing. "So, we killed Tartaros only for an army of demons straight from hell to show up." "We don't know if Tartaros is dead," Gray said after a moment. "Natsu went to deal with marred gear, so I'd say he's dead by now, but there are other members we can't really account for. And it isn't just an army of demons," Gajeel added. "I am certain that Anxeram is there as well, if not the rest of the super assholes." "Supreme," Gray muttered, though he obviously didn't care about the accuracy, turning his dark eyes to the entrance of the room. "Anyway, and I mean Gajeel and I with the cats, managed to drag you all here, and hopefully, no one will find us until all this is over." Arthur stared at the ice mage in shock, managing to push himself into a sitting position. "We're hiding. People are dying out there. Our friends are dying out there and we're hiding." Gray glared at him with such intensity that Natsu would be proud. "You think I want to sit here and do nothing and pray that I will have to keep doing nothing? Out of 8 people in this room I am the only one who can actually fight. What do you think a demon would do if he found you? Do you really think that he would just turn around and think, well, they are defeated so I don't have to bother with killing them? If you two keep screaming like that we won't stay hidden for long," Laxus informed them through gritted teeth as he pushed himself into a sitting position and leaned against a wall. "You should be resting," Gajeel muttered, and Laxus rolled his eyes, "and so should you." "You're right, Gray," Arthur said after few moments passed in silence. "I'm sorry, it's just." Gray sighed, shifting in his position against the wall and adjusting the hold on the small crystal of ice that was lighting up the room. Yay, I get it. Acnologia looked at the screeching demons in the sky and the dragons that were tearing them apart. Their victory was not in question, but his eyes turned to the distant portal and he swallowed. Knowing Natsu and his luck, he was right underneath that portal. And he didn't doubt that Anxeram was there as well. That Zeref was there as well. He growled, blasting another demon away. He couldn't just leave the dragons on their own. Even if they are going to be alright, he was their king. He let Irene die. He let Natsu die once. He won't do it again. He can't do it again. Igneel, he bellowed, turning his head to the red dragon who glanced at him. A grim smile lifted Igneel's lips and the Fire King nodded at the High King. Go. Acnologia paused, suddenly unsure. What kind of a king leaves in the middle of a battle? King should put his people before his family. Go and save the fucking world, you idiot. Acnologia blinked before he nodded and twisted in the air, disappearing in the void. Natsu's response came in the form of a spell. Chaos Dragon's Roar. He was forced to disappear into the void again as the world around him exploded in black and red. He reappeared outside of the void, but this time Natsu was waiting and his fist connected with Zeref's jaw hard enough to send him flying. What did I ever do to you? Something shifted in Zeref's black eyes and they bled red. A snarl pulled his lips apart. You died. That's hardly my fault, Natsu growled, hand reaching towards the book only for Zeref to jump back, and in a flash, the book disappeared into the void. The black mage twisted out of the next kick, bringing up his arm, and a ball of pure black appeared in front of his outstretched palm. It is you and your damned heroics even when we were children. What the fuck are you talking about? He didn't stop even as he looked over the black wizard, magic exploding towards Zeref, and he was moving again, twisting to the side and raising his foot to catch Zeref in the side with it. When Acnologia came to our village and started tearing it apart, Zeref paused, ducking under the blow and sending one of his own that didn't even graze. He looked at Natsu, a frown on his face. You knew Acnologia killed you the first time. It was a statement, not a question, but Natsu still managed to shrug and answer between their trading blows. Anxeram was talkative. Zeref's red eyes narrowed as he spat. He dodged the next attack, the strength behind the spell blowing up at least 50 meters behind him. Of course, he is. Our parents hid us and went outside to help fight against the monster. You followed them. A stupid toddler you were. Natsu snarled as he jumped back, avoiding a barrage of black orbs that turned the stone it hit into dust. He looked at Zeref. Something didn't add up. Something was wrong. Natsu stopped moving. Wait, on Tenro Acnologia because of you. Because he owed you favor for turning him into a dragon. How is that possible if you were still a child when Acnologia's a dragon raised our hometown? Zeref paused as well, a grin splitting his face, his red eyes crazed. He wiggled his fingers in the air. Time travel. Natsu blinked. No, that's impossible. Zeref shrugged. So is bringing back the dead. Natsu scowled. Point. Who do you think made the Eclipse Gate? But really, Natsu, you have to see that everything I ever did was because of you. The Dragon Prince didn't answer, instead of blasting another spell in Zeref's direction. A thought occurred to him. A dark and ugly thought that seemed so ridiculous that he couldn't help but chuckle. Zeref stopped, almost getting blasted off his feet for the minute pause. Why are you laughing? Did it ever occur to you that Acnologia came to that village to kill you while you were still a child? Still helpless to stop you from becoming who you are. Because he knew what you would do. To him, to the world. Zeref stumbled back, not even reacting as Natsu slammed his heel into his chest. That's not possible, is it not? Does that seem so improbable? Is it so hard to imagine that it was your own actions that killed me? Zeref snarled. That's not what happened. That's impossible. Natsu grinned an ugly grin. So is time travel. Zeref's face contorted, eye twitching as he looked at Natsu with wild eyes before he screamed at him a wordless scream, black exploding around him and rushing at the Dragon Prince as if it was alive. Natsu twisted out of the way only for it to turn and lunge at him again. The second it touched him, his skin rotted, falling off, and he cursed, disappearing into the void and appearing above it, watching as it withered and died when it lost sight of him. The second blast was already moving towards him and he dodged again, blasting it away with magic. You are wrong. It was all his fault. Don't you see it? Don't you see it? Acnologia did it all. He ruined us. Another tendril of black joined the first, the magic rising around Natsu like tentacles, too fast for him to dodge, and he hissed as another brushed against his shoulder, skin, and muscles rotting away, and he screamed, falling through the void and appearing on the wall, hand pressing against the bare bone for a brief second before he glanced at it, grimacing at the flesh around the hole even as the muscles already reformed and the skin knitted itself back together. Denial won't get you anywhere. He gathered his magic around him like a cloak, pulling at the curse and magic as quickly as he could as Zeref started advancing towards him, his magic rising around him as if it had a mind of its own, and Natsu swallowed, the weight of it almost physical. Despite appearances, Zeref was a 400-year-old black wizard who was quite possibly stronger than Acnologia. And Natsu would do well to not forget that again. He pushed the magic out, wings painlessly spreading behind him and horns curving on his head, and in the next second, he was in the air, avoiding the next attack. It still left him lightheaded, the painlessness of the transformation, but he didn't have time to delve into it. He had a fight to win. A war to win. A family to save. Chaos dragons roar. Acnologia appeared just above the ruins of Plutogrim, barely even able to turn around when something slammed into him hard enough to knock him straight out of the sky. He gasped in shock as he slammed into the ground, sure that several ribs broke at impact with whatever hit him, but he didn't waste a second before he jumped back onto his feet, turning around to look at what hit him. A figure made of shadows floated down in front of his face, a white grin on the shadowy face. My, Acnologia. What a fun surprise. Acnologia didn't hesitate. He opened his mouth, a roar forming and blasting into the demon god immediately. And here I thought you at least had manners, Anxeram tutted sadly, now floating to Acnologia's right. You never should have come here, Acnologia growled, snapping his teeth at the god who disappeared in a swirl of shadows. I seem to recall that you struggled against me and Natsu last time we fought. If he had visible irises, Acnologia was sure Anxeram would have been rolling his eyes. I was angry, but it was a contract. It was me letting off some steam, as you beasts would say. Nothing more. I was hardly fighting seriously. Acnologia raised an eyebrow at the god, both of them floating in the air, unmoving. A second later the Dragon King shifted, magic coursing through him as he transformed into his human form. It was a form that valued speed and agility over strength and defense. And he had a feeling that that was what he will need. Anxeram's smile widened even further when Acnologia stayed silent. Am I to take your silence as agreement? Take it as disbelief, Acnologia responded flatly, hand outstretched towards the god for barely a second before a wave of chaos energy sprung forth, as tall and white as the Dragon King himself, and he smirked as the god didn't even try to move, only for the magic to split in front of Anxeram like a wave on the cliff. Anxeram gave him a wicked grin. You'll have to try harder than that. Or you can simply leave now and I'll be so kind as to let you and your miserable kin live on that island of yours while I rule this plane. That is your kin, expect Natsu. He is mine, after all. Acnologia snarled, showing all his teeth. Over my dead body will you touch him? Anxeram's grin widened again, spreading from ear to ear. That can be easily arranged. Makarov hurried through the abandoned, ruined streets of Magnolia, struggling to draw in a breath after running for what was likely 20 miles. Even in a Titan form that was no easy task for him, and he cursed his age, dragging himself to the ruins of the guild and stumbling at the first good look at it. His home in shambles, his family, dying, and he, away from it all in a likely vain hope that she might be able to fix the sky. He shifted, enlarging himself as he started the mad, desperate dig to reach the bottom of the guild hall before it's too late. If it wasn't too late already. He paused when he saw the body, feeling his heart skip a bit as his eyes fell on Annie's cooling corpse. Tears sprung to the corners of his old eyes, his hands shook and he nearly dropped the heavy stone he was holding. Biting back a sob, he went back to digging. It is too late already. But at least it isn't over. There was still a chance. The essence of a god, Natsu had said, and Makarov could hear those words as clear as if Natsu has spoken them this very moment. Yes, Mavis had answered. Did you know it is possible to kill a god? Nothing is truly immortal. How the old master hoped that Natsu and Mavis were right. How he hoped that there is at least something he could do. Something to help the fight. Something to make it up to Natsu. He said he would die for his family once. He was ready to make good on that promise. Behind him, over the black, moonless, and starless sky, the sun started rising, red as blood. When Urza saw the monstrous shadow rushing towards them, she did not hesitate in pushing Jellal, who was still carrying Minerva, through the small hole in the ruined wall. His cry of protest as he fell down with an undignified yelp was drowned by the rising volume of the shrieking demons that were growing closer, so the owner of the shadow didn't realize they were there until Urza had her sword pressed against their throat. "Don't move," she hissed at the shadow in the low red light that was coming from the frighteningly red sun. It took her a moment to realize that the shadow was staring at her in surprised shock. Urza blinked. She knew that voice. Altair. Oh, thank God. The time mage moved further out of the shadows of the corner, her disfigured face shifting to relief. Urza was unconvinced and the sword stayed tightly gripped in her hand even as she lowered it away from Altair's face. The Altair's eyes flickered to the sword briefly before she looked back at Urza. Jellal pulled himself out of the hole behind Urza, glaring at the scarlet-haired mage for a brief moment before turning to Altair and stopping short. "What the fuck happened to you?" he blurted out before he could stop himself. Altair grimaced, her second set of hands clasping behind her back as she tried to needlessly get them out of sight. Tartaros apparently knew how to transform people into demons. Urza and Jellal blinked, shocked before a look of utter disgust crossed Urza's face, and it took Altair a second to realize it was not directed at her. "Those bastards," she growled furiously, throwing the sword in a fit of anger, and the weapon disappeared in a flash of golden light before it managed to hit the floor. "They did it to Minerva as well," Jellal muttered, glancing back at the hole in the wall where Minerva still lied sprawled from their fall. Altair blinked, leaning to the side until she could see the dark mage before she turned to Urza, opening her mouth to say something only for Urza to slam into her and wrap her arms around her. The hug was brief and the knight stepped back quickly, nodding to her in what Altair thought might be acceptance, and the time mage smiled. "Thanks. We'll figure something out," Urza told her, completely and utterly sure of that. Altair's smile widened before she nodded and turned serious again. "Where are you two going?" Jellal answered her, the blue-haired mage in the process of pulling Minerva out of the hole, at this point. "Trying to find anyone. I don't know where the rest are, but I have a vague idea where Mira is," Altair said after a moment, "and I know where Natsu is, but I think it's best we don't go after him." Urza and Jellal exchanged a glance, nodding in sync. "We'll go with you then." Altair took a deep breath, relieved almost. The chances of being attacked by a fairy tale member were a lot lower when Urza and Jellal walked behind her. "Natsu said the last time he saw them they were north of here." "Then north it is," Urza said, turning to the path they just passed and marching forward, Altair next to her. Natsu pressed his back against the stone column, wings wrapping around him as black magic blasted around him and splitting around the stone. He panted, one hand pressed against his cheek that was missing most of its flesh and muscle. "You can't win this, Natsu," Zeref screamed over the roaring magic. "Just surrender, I might be able to." The dragon prince snarled, dropping into the void a second before the stone pillar collapsed and he reappeared above Zeref, driving his elbow into the mage's back before he had enough time to dodge. Zeref slammed into the ground with a hiss, rolling immediately as Natsu's clawed foot slammed into the spot where he had been moments earlier, magic around it strong enough to send the stone flying. "Get it into your thick head, already. I'm not surrendering, and you're not winning." Zeref flashed out of existence and reappeared several feet away, standing on his feet. Fingers splayed, magic burst from the ground in black tendrils and Natsu cursed under his breath, jumping into the air and spreading his wings. The damage to his cheek still there, one side of his face showing the teeth as he growled out the name of the spell and opened his mouth wide. Chaos Dragon's Roar. The roar tore through the tendrils and went straight towards Zeref, who jumped out of the way, twisting in the air and sending a black ball of energy flying at Natsu. "You are in denial, brother." The dragon prince dodged out of the way, twisting in the air as the orb passed inches from his face, a snarl splitting his face, and his clawed hand shot towards the black orb, gripping it midair. His flesh sizzling, he turned in the air and sent the orb flying back at the wide-eyed Zeref, who was blasted from his feet. Natsu glanced down at his hand, flexing his fingers. The skin was burned but it was already healing. "Now to figure out how I did that," he muttered under his breath, flying towards where Zeref hit the ground, Chaos Dragon's Iron Fist. Too fast to dodge, Zeref barely had time to bring his hands up as the magic and curse coated around the fist slammed into him. The blow made him sink into the stone floor and he gasped, the ribs breaking on impact, and Natsu's other hand reached for his face, claws digging into his eye, but even as that happened, he wrapped his fingers around Natsu's hand and growled out, "Death Predation." Natsu's eyes widened and he tried to tear his arm free from the vice grip, but the black cloud already exploded around Zeref, turning everything it touched into dust and rot. Zeref let go of his arm the moment the blast hit him and Natsu flew back as if on fire. And that's what it felt like. Maybe even worse. A scream tore from his throat and he stumbled to the ground, skin and muscle turning black, and he choked for a brief moment before gagging, blood exploding from his mouth. "I didn't want it to end like this," Zeref said, sounding genuinely upset, and Natsu turned his face towards him, blinded from the spell but still managing to glare with the intensity that would freeze the fire. "Fuck off, already." Zeref blinked, staring at him as he struggled to stay in the sitting position, a good portion of his ribcage visible. "Wouldn't it be much easier to just let go?" Natsu choked on more blood, ignoring the black wizard and focusing on trying to find some way to fix the damage. He knew that that spell would have killed him had it not been for Anxeram's curse. And the damage would fix itself. But he didn't have the luxury of time to wait for that to happen. Zeref fell silent as well when he received no answer and stood there, watching as Natsu tried to force his hands and feet to move. There was something in the air that Natsu couldn't quite point his finger at. It felt familiar. It had been there since, he couldn't quite remember when he noticed it, but if he thought about it, really thought about it, he was almost certain it stood there, just at the edge of his consciousness since he woke up from the dead. It felt closer every time he successfully twisted someone else's spell, the times when he asked and people answered. It felt dark and twisted, but not evil. It felt terrific and terrifying, and it trailed around him like a cloak. Or maybe that wasn't really correct. It wasn't around him, it was around everything. He was just one of the few who could actually sort of see it. He blinked, empty eye sockets burning with the movement as he tried to concentrate on that something that felt like a long-forgotten memory, some sort of déjà vu that left him feeling uneasy. Zeref stared at him with black eyes, watching as Natsu went very carefully still. Something was going on through his head, and Zeref was not quite sure whether to be worried or annoyed that the pink-haired dragon prince was ignoring him suddenly. With a grimace that settled somewhat between disgusted and peeved, he flicked his hand in the air. The black leather covers of the book appeared in his hands, E.N.D written in bold letters. He looked around for a brief moment, at the raised area around them. Nothing was really left standing, and he once again looked at Natsu, blinking a moment later when he noticed that the bones of his fingers that, until moments ago, stood bare were covered in thin muscles, and the longer he spent staring at it the faster the muscle grew. "Remarkable," he muttered, though he didn't sound particularly interested in it. He was bleeding from more cuts and gashes than he cared to admit, and he was certain that more than one bone was broken. But there wasn't really much time to keep observing the situation that as time went on would probably only get more complicated. He turned his attention back to the book in hand, flicking his wrist to open the book only for a bloody hand with half of its skin and scales missing to wrap around his wrists. Zeref blinked in shock, head snapping back to look at Natsu, who grinned at him, showing all his teeth on his lipless face. Before he could react, Natsu's other hand grabbed his chest and red chaos energy exploded from his palm, sending him flying away with such force that the hand still tightly grasped in Natsu's fist stayed there, tearing off at the elbow. "Chaos Dragon's grip strike," Natsu finished in a tone that sounded like he was the only one in on a great joke. Zeref blinked back the black spots that dotted his vision suddenly, stumbling as he got up to his feet. One hand clutched the stump, black eyes wide more in shock than pain. His head quickly snapped up and he looked at the dragon prince, who rolled his neck as if it was stiff. A good portion of the skin and scales that covered his front half was still missing, and the parts that did regrow were covered in so much blood that it was hard to say where the skin began and muscle ended. And the grin was truly disturbing on his eyeless face. It reminded him of. Zeref flinched as Natsu rushed at him, and in a second Zeref's eyes bled red and he met the fist with his palm, feeling like the magic that coated it corroded his skin just as his own magic did to the others. "I am cursed with the same curse as you," Zeref began as Natsu dodged a kick and then forced the black wizard to jump back himself when he turned his dodge into a strike. But to regenerate even just the lost skin should take hours, maybe even days. He watched as the eyeball formed on a face with no eyelids, and Natsu bared his teeth in another mad grin. Zeref's eyes strayed to Natsu's hands just for a second, and he realized what got the demonized dragon so happy. He was still clutching Zeref's lost hand and the book that the hand held. "You and Anxeram played God with my corpse. Well, you played God with my corpse. Anxeram played an arrogant asshole who thinks that just because he's omnipotent he knows everything." Zeref raised his eyebrow at him, opening his mouth only for Natsu to cut him off. You know what I mean. In any case, what I'm trying to say is neither of you really know what happened to me. I don't know what happened to me, but it does have its uses. Before he could reply, Natsu sent another blast of red, burning hot energy towards him, and Zeref moved out of the way with a scowl. Acnologia was a Dragon King. The Dragon King. A title like that you don't get for being weak. A title like that is earned through blood and battle and pain. He won countless battles, killed countless beings. He sunk a continent and killed one of the original three. That being said, he knew what's it like to lose and what's it like to be weaker than his opponent. That being said, it was a state he didn't find himself in often, and he knew that he had never felt this much out of his depth. Anxeram was not lying when he said that he had been toying with them before. He twisted out of a path of the spell, sending his own from his outstretched hand in one move, but the god simply waved it away. He batted it away as if it was a fly, and it made Acnologia's blood boil. The sky above them and the ground below them were filled with demons. And he didn't even want to think about what the humans from Natsu's guild were dealing with. Would it be too much to ask of you to stand still so that we can get this over with faster? We both know how it's going to end. With you dead and me old and gray, Acnologia replied, a smug smile that felt and was forced settling on his lips. Well, I have the gray part down. He gestured to his silver hair. Now just to get you dead, and then I can work on the second part. Acnologia again had a distinct feeling that Anxeram was rolling his eyes at him. For someone as smart as you are surprisingly dense. You can't win this. Acnologia scowled. Watch me. What was really a pressing matter was closing the hole in the sky and stopping the virtual flood of demons still pouring out. There must be hundreds of them down there by now. Maybe even thousands. The problem with it was that he had no idea how to close the damn thing. The last time he saw the blade of Anxeram was when Zeref took it. And as far as he knew it was still in the grubby little hands of that madman. He should have taken with him some means to contact Igneel. He could really use some help right now. He wished Natsu hadn't used the horn. Even if it did help them on the island, he would much rather use it now. As much as he hated to admit it, the dragons should have come here and left the island until this was dealt with. This was a losing battle that they were fighting as long as the hole in the sky was still there. Closing that is not really an option presented to you, Anxeram noted dryly. The god was casually floating a few feet in front of him, obviously sure enough in himself to let Acnologia think. It didn't help that he could hear what Acnologia thought as clear as if the Dragon King had said it. Acnologia's scowl deepened and he bared his teeth. Avoiding the hordes of demons prowling the ruins of Plutogrim was pretty much impossible at this point. Altair knew that, Jellal knew that, Urza knew that. Demons also knew that. An ugly thing that looked like a skinless bastard child of a dog, a lizard, and a shark appeared in front of them, wearing a grin on its teeth-filled, skinless mouth that was wide enough to fit Urza's whole head in. The creature didn't have any eyes on the smooth surface of its wet skin, but it was clearly well aware that they were there. Another creature appeared beside the first, followed by another and another until they were surrounded, and Altair cursed. We're surrounded, Urza voiced it in a quiet, tense voice. Jellal had already dropped Minerva to the ground, not even bothering to be gentle about it. It was bound to happen sooner or later, Jellal said, rolling his injured shoulder as much as he could, trying to make the numb arm attached to it respond. The number of demons pouring down that hole is something I don't even want to think about. It's rather funny if you think about it, Altair said as the hissing and clicking of the demons around them grew louder, sounding like something between laughter and taunting and leering. The two looked at her as if she had lost her mind. We went to hell and back with barely a scratch, and now hell came to earth. I don't see the humor in this, Urza cut coldly, sword appearing in her hand, and as if that was the sign the creatures waited, they lunged forward, maws snapping and hissing like snakes and moving far too fast. Some were smaller than a dog and some were larger than a horse, and no matter how much he tried to suppress it, Jellal would be lying if he said he wasn't scared shitless. Altair's smile was not one that found it really funny either, as she circled her hands and the orb multiplied around her head, speeding towards the closest demon. You don't. We survived hell and now hell came to kill us. Jellal twisted out of the way of a demon as it jumped at him, sending a burst of magic that sent it flying back, and the light that his spell created around them was enough for him to realize that Minerva's eyes were open and that the demonized mage was staring at him with wide, pleading eyes full of terror. She couldn't move, she couldn't scream, because he bound her. And he became painfully aware of that when two demons lunged at her and started tearing her apart. Jellal turned away too late to miss the horror-filled, painful expression on her face before they tore off her head. He might have hated her, but he will still have nightmares about those eyes. He just knew it. He dodged another demon, his injured hand not really cooperating with him as he tried to blast them and managed to miss. Urza saved him, showing her sword straight through the roof of the horse-sized demon and tossing him aside as if he was a great sack of sand. He could see what Ultir was talking about though, even as terror gripped his heart and squeezed harder, pumping adrenaline into him with such force he was scared his lungs and heart might burst. "You're right, Ultir." He crossed his arms and twisted his fingers, preparing a spell. "It's hilarious." 3 demons turned towards him, one still gnawing on Minerva's hand. "Alteris, chance if you leave now," Laxus said through gritted teeth, pushing himself to his feet, and Gray had to fight back the need to stare at him in utter amazement. He couldn't be distracted now. "I'm not leaving you." Laxus gave a sad smile and looked at Gajeel and Arthur, who both, as much as they struggled, couldn't stand up. "I know." Touching, the orange demon purred in a voice that sounded like cutting glass. Lucy swallowed dryly, looking over her shoulder at Ares and Canna. Perliusica stood in the corner of the room, bleeding but still managing to look as strict and straight-backed as always. The injured members of the guild were forced to be returned into the cards, tightly gripped in Perliusica's hand, but it was better than the alternative. They managed to kill 3 demons that stumbled across their little hiding spot, Elfman taking care of the last one and as a reward for his efforts lost a good portion of his fingers on his left hand. They once again heard the scraping and growling growing closer, and they all were getting sick of it. "Makarov, you better hurry up with whatever you are doing, you old bastard," Perliusica muttered as an eye on a stalk turned a corner and blinked at them before curling in a mockery of a smile. His hands were bleeding and he managed to break a finger. It didn't slow him down though as he pushed another stone out of the way. The demons that were pouring out from the literal hellhole were close to reaching Magnolia by now, and Makarov could feel the rising urgency with every passing second. Things were starting to get desperate. He could feel it in his bones. He knew it as sure as he knew that the sun should not be red. But it shouldn't be far now. The entrance, he hoped. It was hard to tell. The rubble was already proving to be in a bigger pile than he originally thought. Wendy felt like someone punched her in the gut hard enough to make a hole. Like someone pulled her lungs through her mouth and then pulled every joint and muscle in a direction it shouldn't go. And that was not even accounting to the emotional turmoil that made the agony of being so thoroughly beaten and magically exhausted feel like a light slap. She glanced at Happy and then at Carla and couldn't help but feel utter contempt at them. They both were crying. She was crying too, but she would much rather die with her friends than run away. But apparently, that was all she was good at. Maybe it wasn't contempt at the cats that she felt but at herself. "You fuckers stay away from her." The furious shout came from below them and Wendy blinked in shock, looking down just in time to see Jellal blast away a demon that was about to bite off Urza's head. They were surrounded, and from the view above that she had, she knew that the numbers were far too great even for Urza, Jellal, and, was that Ultir? "Put me down, Happy." Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. She wasn't even sure what she hoped to accomplish anymore, but even if she tried to deny it, her mind already knew. A death, quick or slow. Everything that happened, everything she did, she had to make it right. Somehow, Natsu deserved a better sister than she was. Natsu deserved a lot more than he ever got. And if her presence made the demons take their eyes off of the 3 below them for even a second, she will gladly just lie down and let them tear her apart. "Wendy," Carla hissed, and Happy just looked horrified. The poor blue cat looked ready to suffocate in his own sobs and tears. She wasn't sure she saw him stop crying since she woke up. "Put me down, now." Another demon came too close to Ultir and it was more luck than skill that saved her from it. "Wendy," Happy managed, "you'll die." The girl blinked, not sure what surprised her about that sentence. She had just been thinking about that. Maybe it was the utter shock in Happy's voice. Maybe it was something else entirely. She didn't know, but she still pushed at Happy's tail and paws as much as she could, and the cat frantically tightened his grip on her. She was delirious, a part of her traitorous brain whispered. They were already past the 3 mages. Too far to help, and all she would accomplish by getting out of Happy's grip right now would be to plummet to her death. She wondered how painful would that be. The blue cat suddenly stopped and looked at Carla. Confusion etched itself on Carla's face for a brief moment before it was replaced with fury. Happy. Don't you dare. But the blue little cat was already flying back at full speed. Wendy couldn't help but smile a little. It wasn't a happy one. Thank you, Happy, don't thank me for killing you. When did it get this serious? Makarov hissed as he pulled at a large piece of debris only for it to break in half and fall on his foot. For fucks. You always struck me as a polite man. Hearing you swear is rather surprising. Makarov lifted his head so fast his neck gave a loud pop. Lilith looked at him, half-lit eyes bored. He tensed, swallowing down the uneasiness and forcing himself into a position, ready to spring into action. He might be old but he was not slow nor weak. Who are you? How do you know who I am? She took a step forward and Makarov quickly added, I will kill you if you come any closer. Lilith didn't appear particularly threatened or intimidated. In fact, she shrugged as if they were discussing the weather and didn't agree on whether it would rain. Don't take this personally, I'm just doing my job. And as for how I know you, well, we have a mutual acquaintance. I'm Lilith if that interests you so much. Makarov opened his mouth to reply but closed them with a snap. He couldn't think of anything worth saying. Nothing that was short in any case. Lilith didn't seem particularly interested in a one-sided conversation either and she lunged at him, quick as a snake. There was something incredibly disturbing in how she moved, Makarov decided. And it became a lot more apparent when she dropped to the ground, seemingly spineless, to avoid his enlarged fist. A snake. Fitting I suppose. Lilith sprang to her feet behind him and he spun on his heel, fist already clasped tightly and moving to her head. All Lilith did was stretch her neck, suddenly longer than half her body, and her head dropped to the side, Makarov's fist harmlessly passing above her. She could have dodged that in a variety of different ways. Probably easier than this. Makarov knew that and he had lied his eyes on the demon for not even a minute. She was doing this to make him uneasy. She was doing a good job too. Her head moved up, the neck still impossibly long and her lips spread in a grin filled with sharp teeth. She moved to attack him but was blasted clean of her feet by a white light that nearly blinded him. Now that is just disturbing, Makarov blinked at the newcomer. Newcomers actually. Sting. Rogue. The blonde dragon slayer grinned at him and Rogue offered a small smile. We're here too, old man, Lecter grumbled and Frosh waved happily. Makarov blinked, feeling rather stupid. What are you doing here? Sting blinked at him, his eyes moving away from Makarov just in time to see Lilith climb back to her feet some distance off. The attack didn't even leave a scratch. All it did was get her clothes dusty from the debris. She turned her slitted eyes towards the three. And she still looked bored. In Makarov's opinion that was worrying beyond words. What are we doing here? Sting raised an eyebrow as if that was the stupidest question he had heard in a while. There is a hole in the sky a couple miles away from Magnolia. I wouldn't be surprised if every guild in Fury isn't on their way over. Sabretooth certainly is. We're just faster than most. He flashed another quick grin and Lilith apparently let us talk long enough because she was moving again. You're welcome, Lecter added with a grin of his own as he leapt into the air and pulled Frosh with him. We didn't expect an army of demons, Rogue spoke up, sending a quick spell at Lilith who dodged it effortlessly. But one should not be a problem. You do realize that I'm right here, boys? Lilith asked, sharp teeth glinting in the red sun, and I would like to see how one demon who is capable of going toe-to-toe with Natsu Souleater is not a problem. Sting's grin faltered but his speed did not as he dodged Lilith's attack and sent his own kick that was blocked with no effort. You're bluffing, Lilith shrugged, believe what you want. She barely managed to stand on her own feet when Happy put her down in front of Urza who immediately cursed at them. What do you think you're doing here? Saving you, and that might have had more weight if she didn't feel ready to kneel over. By dropping dead, she slammed another demon away, barely standing. You're surrounded from all sides. Happy said, flying up into the air, barely avoiding being cut in half by a claw. We know that already, Jellal yelled back, kicking a demon away from Wendy. Wendy frowned at him, I'm going to distract them and you will make a run for it. You must have hit your head pretty hard if you think that that's going to happen, Altair hissed. Wendy turned wide eyes towards them, stumbling out of the way. What was she thinking? Why did she think that they would listen to her? Please, you have to listen to me. There are hundreds of these things crawling all over the place. If you If we run now, it's only a matter before they catch up to us again. If that's the case, Urza said, her face grim. We are dying here, Jellal said, pale and obviously frightened, but his hands did not shake and his voice did not falter. But that's okay. It wasn't. We've all seen hell. Ultir's voice carried a tilt of an inside joke that no one found funny. Maybe it's time for some to see heaven. She glanced at Urza and the scarlet-haired mage snorted. As if, Urza said, hissing as a demon managed to leave a deep gash in her arm before she pierced its skull with a sword. I'll take a rain check on that. I'm going where you're going. Wendy gritted her teeth, snapping a fist at a demon that came too close. Magic refused to answer to her calls, but she could still punch things. Her knee gave out from under her and she stumbled, and in a second a demon was on top of her. Wendy, so much for being a hero. Foolish child. She blinked, eyes wide. That sounded like Laxus and Grey were doing a pretty good job at keeping the big orange one and the snake one at bay. The smaller, black things the size of a dog, shaped like a cross between a scorpion and a spider, were another story. Arthur gritted his teeth as he blasted one with a surge of shadow that was hardly half the strength he usually had. The teen was swaying unsteadily on his feet and Gajeel knew it was only a matter of time before he passed out. He was going better in the magic department, but he couldn't even properly step on his leg and his back was literally against the wall. The two couldn't hope to get Grey or Laxus to help either. They had their hands full. Gajeel grimaced as he slammed his club-shaped hand into the demon's 20-eyed face. 20-something. He wasn't going to count. Lightning dragons roar. The whole sky above them seemed to explode in lightning and Arthur stumbled, hand gripping at the wall as the room shook. A demon immediately lunged at him and the shadow user extended his other arm, realizing too late that all he had was a stump, and it wasn't until the demon managed to slam the sharp, blade-like legs into his stomach that Gajeel managed to cut it down. Arthur slid down to the floor, hissing, and Gajeel cursed. Shit, shit, shit. He pushed himself towards the shadow user, blasting one of the closer demons away. There were 7 more, 8 actually. The one he just pushed away snapped back to his feet. Hold on, Junior. He cursed again and Arthur coughed out far too much blood for this to be healthy. As if he hadn't lost enough blood already. He stared at Gajeel, watching him for what felt like an eternity but wasn't even a second probably. I don't wanna die. The Iron Dragon Slayer felt as if someone punched him in the gut and he turned away from Arthur, pulling himself to his feet as best as he could with one foot mangled as much as it was. I'll get you out of here, Arthur. But their chances didn't look particularly good. He decided, turning briefly towards the hole in the ceiling to take a look at Grey and Laxus just in time to see Laxus flying from what must have been a nasty blow. He looked at the remaining demons in the room. They looked as if they were laughing at them, their mandibles clicking, poison dripping from their mouth and tail, and Gajeel could only hope that there was none on their blade-like feet. He glanced at Arthur and the teen looked barely awake. Don't you dare fall asleep, Arthur. He yelled as loud as he could, but the younger mage didn't so much as flinch. Gajeel knew at that moment as he failed to dodge an attack and the demon pierced his good leg with the blade. He cried out, falling to the ground. Gajeel knew it then. They were all going to die. A demon positioned the poison tail above him. All that could save them now was a miracle. He could hear a frantic shout of his own name somewhere in the distance. It sounded like Grey, but it was hard to hear him over the sound of buzzing in his head that overpowered every other noise. I don't have a miracle for you. I just have me. But the voice in his head was lying, Gajeel decided. Because it was a miracle. Lilith sighed as she walked over to Makarov's crumpled form as the Titan tried to stand up. Sting cursed, pushing himself to his feet. The demon in front of them was ruthless. And strong. And he had a feeling she wasn't lying when she said that she had fought Natsu before. The fact that she was even alive after it let Sting know all he needed to know. Rogue ran past him, intent on sending the demoness flying away from the old master. Lilith let go of the old man and turned towards Rogue in a fluent motion that Sting was starting to despise. She caught his fist and slammed her own into his stomach before he could react, lifting him clean off of his feet. Rogue landed a foot away from Sting just as he fired his own spell. White dragons roar. Lilith jumped away. The demon still managed to look bored. Makarov appeared underneath her, enlarged fist slamming into her back before she could recover, and Rogue joined in with his own roar. Shadow dragons roar. Her eyes widened a tiny bit. Sting counted it as a victory. Both he and Rogue were in dragon force and it did them squat. He didn't feel this inadequate in a fight since he fought Natsu in the Grand Magic Games. And it frustrated him more than words could describe. By the furious look on Rogue's face, he felt the same. Lilith was back on her feet before anyone managed to land another hit, grinning and for the first time not looking bored. I'd almost compliment you on that one. What do you even want? Makarov growled, panting. The demoness blinked, speaking in a voice that said, I thought it was obvious. She said as much, Fairy Heart. I thought that was obvious. Sting frowned and he could see Rogue do the same. Makarov just looked horrified and 10 shades paler. What? Who? How? Lilith rolled her eyes, once again looking bored. I'm Anxeram's second in command. Everything Zeref knows he knows. And the Lord is kind enough to let me in on certain things. Sting choked, eyes widening. Second in command, Anxeram. Rogue looked even more troubled and Sting suddenly wondered if all this was a bad joke. He looked at Makarov. Anxeram's here, as in, the god straight from hell, Anxeram is here. Lilith laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. Who do you think is leading the charge? Though from what I know he is currently engaged in a fight with the dear old Acnologia. And Acnologia was here too. Sting wasn't sure if he was happy or terrified at the notion. Rogue seemed to share his thoughts. A troubling predicament indeed. Sting was certain the sound of buzzing that filled his head was the sound of his own sanity leaving him. That voice, there was no way that. He caught Rogue's eyes and the Shadow Dragon Slayer seemed to have heard something too. He wondered if he heard the same thing. Or if he heard the voice of someone else. It is too soon, but the end of the world is not a time for regrets. Rogue knew that voice too. Igneel looked over the island. The demons were growing pretty thin in numbers. He wouldn't even call it a battle now. Clean up maybe. His eyes moved to the distant dark hole and he frowned. It's time to move to the next target. Acnologia already reached his destination, no doubt. He doubted the Dragon King would mind if a few more came to join him. Himmel, Kindra, Adalstian, Demur, all four were close enough to hear him bark their names. They looked at him, expressions attentive and quizzical and almost hopeful. You're coming with me. Kindra's face split in a grin that showed all her teeth and she nudged Adalstian whose own grin parted his lips. Demur nodded, smiling and Himmel straightened his back, nodding as well. Atlas Flame landed next to him, one flaming eyebrow raised, and what about me? You'll stay here and clean the rest of these fuckers, Igneel replied, spreading his wings. I promised Acnologia that we'll keep the island safe. I never said I'll stay on it and do it myself. He grinned and added, I think, in any case, you're in charge of the fire dragons until we get back, Atlas Flame. The 5 dragons spread their wings and propelled themselves towards the hole, disappearing from sight in mere moments. Queen Emerald appeared next to Atlas Flame, her green scales covered in blood and her furred collar matted against the scales, shining crimson. It feels wrong, just letting them go off like that to fight a god. Atlas Flame nodded. It might be a god and his army that they are facing, but dragon kings and queens are worth each an army. They will be fine. They have Acnologia. They have Natsu. Emerald stared after them before turning her head towards Atlas Flame again. I hope you're right. With that, she left, jumped off of the edge of the island and spread her wings. Atlas Flame stayed silent for another moment before joining the fray himself. I hope I'm right, too. Natsu pulled his book out of Zeref's lost hand, wondering for a brief second if he could just destroy it. It didn't seem like a good idea. Zeref didn't really let him think about it for long, rushing at him with a swirl of black tendrils around him. The Dragon Prince dodged the first 2 and twisted out of the way of Zeref's fist. In one fluid motion, he was jumping away and sent a blast of chaos energy at the Black Wizard. Zeref turned towards him, red eyes flashing madly in rage as he reached for the book and Natsu's grip on it tightened, magic sparking around the worn cowers. With his eyes trained on Zeref, it wasn't hard to see the way he flinched at it and Natsu paused, curious. What would happen if I destroyed this book? Zeref stopped moving completely and opened his mouth to reply, but Natsu spoke before he had a chance. Something of consequence for you would be my guess. Don't even think about it, Zeref growled, you'd kill yourself. Natsu raised an eyebrow at him, wouldn't my death make your life easier? And besides, you do realize I'm immortal now. You don't even know what that book does. Are you willing to take that risk? Quite frankly, Natsu thought the answer was a resounding, no. Death didn't really hold the same meaning as it did before to him. Having died once already, or twice if he was being honest with himself, changes things for a person. But be that as it may, and his own personal feelings about his death didn't change the fact that Fairy Tail needed him. Now more than ever, his eyes briefly flickered to the sky and to the dark hole. Just in time to see a humanoid shape barreling towards him, too fast even for him to dodge, and he was picked clean off his feet, flying back. Zeref blinked, shocked at the speed of the collision, and he looked up, red eyes narrowing in disgust as Anxeram floated to a stop a few feet away. The god smiled at the dark mage. "Zeref, Anxeram," the black wizard said, not even trying to hide his displeasure. "Damn, brat, you look like shit," Acnologia grounded out as he pushed himself off of his son, who sat up with a grimace, ignoring the hand the Dragon King offered him as he pulled his legs underneath him and stood up. Acnologia's eyes stayed on Natsu, taking in the obvious lack of skin and muscle on several areas, the still exposed parts of his skull, the book coated in crimson blood gripped in Natsu's hands. "I've been worse," Natsu finally said, happy to note that the impact only broke a rib. Acnologia seemed to flinch at his words, but the movement was so small and fast he thought he might have imagined it. He looked over Acnologia, at the bloodstains on the king's skin and the already forming bruises and bleeding gashes. "You look like shit, too." Acnologia seemed to contemplate whether to deign that with an answer before ultimately ignoring it and turning to look at Anxeram and Zeref. He fought back a grimace. Great, both of them in the same spot. Just what they needed. "Natsu, it's good to see you again." "Fuck off," Anxeram frowned, the reason he didn't expect such an answer beyond Natsu. The shadowy face of the god darkened as he sent the Dragon Prince a glare before he looked at Acnologia. "My initial goal was not to interfere with this fight, but I can't say that killing you in front of Natsu doesn't make my rotting insides all giddy." Acnologia rolled his eyes, leaning forward slightly and getting ready to continue the fight. "Bring it on." Anxeram smirked, raising a hand towards the Dragon King. "Gladly." Natsu watched as his father sprung into action, and as if that was a sign, Zeref waited for the black wizard appeared in front of him, fist already moving towards Natsu's head. The Dragon Prince ducked and brought his hand around Zeref's middle, pivoting on the spot and slamming Zeref into the floor, only to be forced to jump back as black energy erupted around the black wizard. A flash of blue above them made Natsu's eyes flicker up, watching for not even a moment as Acnologia sent a roar at Anxeram, who flicked his hand through the air, splitting the roar in two, and sending half of it at Natsu and Zeref. His attention already away from Zeref, the mage was inches away from punching Natsu when the Dragon Prince spread his wings and pushed out of the way of the wayward attack with all his might, managing to avoid most of it but involuntarily ending up in the path of the vengeful god. Anxeram grinned widely, black balls of energy erupting around Natsu and exploding in a second before he could react, and Acnologia cursed, sending another blast of chaos magic at the god just as Zeref emerged from the dust of the roar and was sent flying away after Acnologia's attack clipped him. "Fuck," Acnologia cursed under his breath, staring at the smoking area where Natsu had been, only to see the Dragon Prince exit a void behind Anxeram, wicked grin on the bloody face. Chaos Dragon's iron fist. Anxeram was already moving when Natsu appeared behind him, but the blow still glanced his shoulder, making him move several feet across the sky where he flew. Acnologia rushed over, knowing full well that the god wouldn't even be phased, only for Zeref to reach the fighting pair before him, pale fingers reaching for the book in Natsu's grip, and Acnologia finally managed to see the lettering on the worn leather. He felt himself grew paler, barely keeping himself from freezing in the spot. That had no right to be there. Why hasn't Natsu already gotten rid of it? "Natsu, get rid of that thing." The Dragon Prince didn't turn around to talk back, thankfully, as he pushed Zeref back and then flew up to avoid Anxeram, the god missing the Dragon Prince only thanks to Acnologia, who had sent another blast of magic at him. "What exactly do you want me to do with it?" "Destroy it." Zeref's red eyes flashed and he appeared behind Acnologia in a flash, jumping onto his back and wrapping his arms around the Dragon King's throat before the other could react. "No." Acnologia cursed, digging his fingers deep into Zeref's arms before he tore him off and sent him flying through the sky with a blast of chaos magic. He hissed suddenly, pain blossoming over his back and neck and fingers, and he looked down at the blackened, purplish skin on his fingers and grimaced. "I did already, but Zeref said it would kill me." "And you believe him?" They shouldn't be arguing right now. Not when Anxeram didn't let Natsu stay in the same spot for more than a second and Zeref was actively trying to turn him into a rotting corpse with blasts of black energy. "I don't." Natsu bit back through clenched teeth, landing on the ground not far from Acnologia for a second before he sprang back into the sky. But I can't really risk it right now. Then throw it into the void. Natsu blinked as if that never occurred to him, the sudden hitch in his step enough to let Anxeram land a solid hit in his side and make a deep gash in his stomach. Natsu. The dragon prince coughed, blood spurting from his mouth as his lips twisted into a scowl. I'm fine, old man, he flexed his fingers, both hands now empty, and Acnologia paused, staring in question, and Natsu quickly supplied the answer. But that could be a problem. Anxeram followed the pointing hand to the book that Zeref once again clutched in a white-knuckled grip, and the god scowled. He knew what the book is. What he didn't know was what would happen. And to Anxeram, not knowing something was a completely foreign concept. And he didn't like it. Not one bit. You idiot, why didn't you do something about it before? Do I have to spell it out to you all the time? Acnologia couldn't help but yell out as he sent an icy glare at Natsu, who shot his father a glare of his own. I was a bit preoccupied, the dragon prince bit out. And besides, who's to say Zeref couldn't just... Shut up, both of you, Zeref spoke up, almost casual in the way he dragged the edge of his clothes over the covers of the book. And he would probably say more if the sound of wings on the wind like thunder and the roars that vibrated through everything didn't nearly deafen them all. The four paused, looking up to the sky as shadows flew around them in the distance. Natsu and Acnologia shared a quick look, grin working its way on their lips. With this, he dared to hope that there might be someone left alive by the end of this nightmare. He wasn't really sure why it surprised him so much, but it was a nice surprise nonetheless. He had already accepted the fact that he was about to die. He didn't like it, but he accepted it, because the number of ugly black things that were ready to riddle him with holes was far too large. He already lost too much blood. The missing hand, the hole in his stomach. He regretted not saying some things. A lot of things. He regretted not saving Annie. But at least he and Annie would be together soon. But it didn't really bring much comfort. Because he knew by the end of the day a lot of people would join them on the other side. And none of them deserved it. Arthur felt a tear slide down his cheek, but he didn't even have enough strength to lift his arm to do anything about it. He looked at Gajeel. The dragon slayer sat a few feet away. He looked oddly frozen in his spot, and Arthur wondered if he was already dead. A flash of lightning above him let him know at least Laxus was alive, but he couldn't bring himself to even twist his neck up. He didn't want to die. He looked at the black creature, its numerous eyes mere inches from his face, drool falling from its jaw onto Arthur's chest and face, and if he had enough strength in him, he would have gagged. As it was, all that escaped was a soft grunt. I don't wanna die, I don't wanna die, not now, not yet. The demon above him opened its jaws, ready to bite his head. Horror filled him as he realized what was about to happen. He would be eaten alive. Arthur couldn't think of a worse death. Maybe he'd be lucky enough to bleed out before the thing started tearing him apart. He blinked, the putrid stench of rot that was coming from the demon in front of him somehow lesser, like it was being blown away by the wind, and he struggled to figure out what was happening. It took him another moment to force his eyes to open again. And the demon was nowhere to be seen. He blinked again, trying to make sense of the silver shape in front of him, of the curved tail and spread wings. But his brain refused to process it. Gajeel suddenly appeared in front of him, tears streaming down the dragon slayer's cheeks and his mouth moving. Arthur wondered what he was saying. It made no sense. And he was tired. And he was dying. Being aware that you are dying is terrifying. Arthur wondered if this is how Natsu felt like. He will have to ask him. Once he wakes up. And he let his eyes close. Sure, he was real. There will be a better time for this conversation. Lilith swallowed, aware that now every eye was once again on her. She didn't know who the two dragons were, but she was not stupid. She wouldn't be able to defeat both of them, and even if there was any chance of doing that, the three humans around would be enough to finish the job. She should retreat. She doubted they would let her leave. And really, she couldn't leave even if that was the best course of action. Anxeram would not be pleased. She shuddered at the thought. She offered a weak smirk to the dragons that felt more like a grimace on her face. I don't suppose you'd let me take what I need. No, Makarov answered quickly. Don't you fucking dare die now, Junior, Gajeel growled, pressing a hand to the bleeding wound on the teen's stomach. Arthur stared at him blankly, green eyes glassy and unfocused, and Gajeel cursed again, his vision getting blurry from the tears, and he wasn't even sure if he was crying from frustration, relief, happiness, or anger. Metallicana behind him blasted the snake-like demon into pieces. The cause of these fucking tears was definitely the sudden appearance of his father. The shock too much for their current situation. But now that he started crying, he couldn't stop and he hated it. He cursed again, ripping off what remained of his shirt and tied it around Arthur's stomach. He was not a child, he shouldn't be bawling his eyes out. Pull it together, Red Fox, he told himself, biting his lower lip hard enough to draw blood. Arthur's head lolled forward and Gajeel looked up with a curse. Don't you fall asleep, Arthur. Don't you dare, keep those eyes open. Gajeel got a feeling Arthur didn't even hear him at this point, glassy eyes and a blank stare his only answer. He already looked dead. The kid will die soon. The round head of his father appeared in the corner of his vision and Gajeel had to fight back another string of curses as Arthur's eyes closed and he slumped against the wall. The Dragon Slayer looked at his father completely now, looking over his face, searching for any change in the smooth metallic surface. There was none. Metallicana looked exactly as he did 7 years ago, or was it 8? Or 14 now? Gajeel had no idea anymore. He wanted to jump to his feet and hug him. Or punch him. A thought occurred to him. Wait, Gray. Laxus. Fine, came Gray's voice, raspier and more pained than the last time Gajeel heard him and he looked to his other side where Gray was helping Laxus sit down. Both didn't look fine. He told them as much. Well, better than we would have been had the dragon not shown up, Laxus said and Gajeel barely recognized the voice. Laxus looked at Metallicana, then at Gajeel, and then back at the dragon, a look of realization dawning and he blinked, shocked and dazed. Gray stayed silent, eyes on the still form of Arthur instead of the dragon. Finally, Gray spoke, nodding his head towards Arthur hesitantly, as if the mere mention might cause further damage to the injured teen. Is he? Gajeel bit the inside of his cheek, looking from Arthur to Metallicana. Not yet. Soon if he doesn't get any help. Metallicana spoke up again and Gajeel decided he would rather punch him. Yay, I heard you the first time, you bastard, the Dragon Slayer snapped, turning his red eyes to Metallicana. And if you haven't noticed, we don't really have a healer here. He slumped against the wall after he said that, the anger leaving him as quickly as it appeared. No, not really leaving, just different. He looked back at Metallicana, noting that Laxus and Gray were silent, both focused on the dragon. Maybe too injured to speak in Laxus' case. He hoped the other Dragon Slayer wouldn't end up like Annie. Like Arthur. He gritted his teeth. It felt like giving up. He already buried the guy and he wasn't even dead yet. Where have you been? It took Gajeel a moment to realize he was the one that asked the question. Metallicana looked at him, expression closed off. It didn't really surprise the Dragon Slayer. Metallicana was always an asshole. He started to think the dragon would ignore him with how long it took before he finally opened his mouth. That is complicated. I see no issue in telling you but now is not the time, Gajeel grounded out, glaring at him. I don't fucking care. You disappeared without a word. I knew you were a selfish bastard but goodbye, would have been nice. If Gajeel didn't know any better he'd say. Metallicana looked almost apologetic as he spoke, don't be a brat. I told you I'll tell you when. When Anxeram kills us all. Metallicana's odd, apologetic expression disappeared and Gajeel didn't have any problem with recognizing the one that appeared now, annoyance. Stop interrupting me. I learned my manners from you, so you only have yourself to blame. Gray and Laxus watched the two going back and forth, not really saying anything that would explain what was going on. The ice user sighed heavily, regretting it immediately when his broken ribs protested and turned to look at Arthur. Natsu will kill us if Arthur dies. Laxus snorted derisively and it surprised the ice mage that the Dragon Slayer was still awake. If we survive long enough for Natsu to kill us, I'll count that as a win. Gray couldn't help but agree. She thought she had blinked but she must have passed out because the creatures were running away and above her stood the white, feathered form of her mother, one clawed foot wrapped protectively around Wendy. The blue-haired girl stared, tears already welling up in her eyes. Grandine roared and it was the most beautiful sound Wendy ever heard. For a brief moment, she thought everything was fixed. She believed the world was whole again and she sat up with some difficulty, staring at the white dragon in pure amazement only to catch the sight of the still open black hole and it was all it took for the reality to come crashing down. It wasn't over yet, but Grandine was here, and at least something finally felt right. Gee Grandine, the hoarseness of her voice took her by surprise. The dragon didn't look at her though, opening her jaw and sending a roar that obliterated dozens of the demons. Wendy blinked, wondering briefly if she was seeing things, and she looked around. Jellal and Urza were still fighting off some demons, but their numbers were now quickly dwindling, and the two kept casting the dragon that suddenly appeared, uneasy glances mixed with worry and relief. Altair kept looking at Grandine as well, between her own spells, and Wendy decided that she wasn't imagining things. An explosion of spells, from the dragon and the three fairy tale mages, and quickly, suddenly, the surrounding area fell silent. It felt surreal. They were about to die. All of them were prepared for it. And now, suddenly, they were alive. Grandine straightened her long neck, moving carefully so that she didn't step on Wendy before she lowered the feathered body down to the ground and looked at the four humans. The five stared at each other, none breaking the silence. The four humans didn't seem to dare breath, and the dragon seemed content to just watch them for a moment. Finally, the dragon's blue eyes focused on the blue-haired dragon slayer. Wendy. The gentle voice of her mother broke the silence, and Wendy heard Jellal take in a sharp breath as if he remembered that he should breathe. Wendy blinked, wiping the tears out of her eyes with the back of her dirty hand, smearing dirt and blood over her face. But her lips parted in a grin, and she tried to stand, legs shaking, and Happy appeared, lifting her up and carrying her to Grandine, who took her from the cat's grasp with a gentle claw, and Wendy collapsed in the soft grip, sobbing. "I thought I'd never see you again," Wendy hiccuped, trying and failing to wipe the tears out of her eyes before finally just burying her face into the feathers. Grandine stayed silent for a moment longer, gentle blue eyes on Wendy. "I am sorry I left without a warning, Wendy. But I am here now." Soft blue light covered Wendy's skin, and the dragon slayer gasped in shock, feeling as her wounds closed, skin knitting together, and all that was left of her injuries in a moment was the half-dried blood. Wendy smiled, opening her mouth as she took in a deep breath, her mother coaxing the regeneration of her magic in her core. She was still exhausted. No amount of magic will replace sleep, but she could fight again. And right now, that was enough. Soon, too soon, Grandine was putting her down to the ground, and the dragon once again looked at the humans, who still stood shell-shocked a distance away. "Your friends, I assume?" Wendy nodded quickly, gesturing to the mages to come closer. They did not move. Wendy suddenly wondered if she had any right to call them her friends anymore. Urza, Jellal, Altair, and Happy. She pointed at each and all. The response the dragon got was a single nod from Urza. The dragon didn't show any sign of annoyance or indignation at the lack of response. If anything, she looked understanding. "Have no fear, children. My name is Grandine. My only intention here is to help you in this dire situation." Urza spoke first, nodding haltingly again, as Wendy said, "I am Urza Scarlet. We thank you for your assistance, but if you do not mind, we have more pressing matters to attend to than to stand here." Grandine hummed in agreement, standing up and spreading her wings. "You are injured. Let me heal you, and then we can continue unimpaired." Gray and Laxus and Happy suddenly cried out, the blue cat frantic, and Wendy's own eyes widened. She felt more than saw Urza and the other two tense as well, and knew they recognized the problem immediately. Grandine. Quote. Natsu snarled at the title before he could stop himself, not that he wanted to. Acnologia swallowed, a look of distaste on his face. "When Anxeram and other gods turned you into a demon," the black-haired mage smiled pleasantly, ignoring the warning growl that left Anxeram's throat, "they unknowingly merged E.N.D with you." Natsu started, mouth falling open. Acnologia's nostrils flared, a sharp intake of breath. His red eyes slid to his fingers, and he stared at his hands in shock. And suddenly it all made sense. All the little oddities that no one could explain. The way he could force someone to answer. The way he could redirect others' attacks. The way he could control chaos. The anger he had felt when he first woke up in hell that never felt truly his. The doors in his mind that were open. The reason his transformations were no longer painful. The reason his magic was starting to lose the black in its color. The reason his magic was no longer a burning cold but a scorching hot. The reason his dragon form was different. The way he seemed to lose control in a fight. There was so much. He suddenly wondered why he didn't realize that earlier. Natsu blinked, perplexed and unsure, and he looked at Acnologia, trying to find some sort of explanation that was definitely not there. He half expected some sort of betrayed or hurt or maybe even angry look on Acnologia's face. But there was none, and in the next second, he wondered why he expected anything else but the surprise at the news. Nothing else. Just surprise. Acnologia. His father didn't look at him any differently. Something of his feelings must have shown on his face because Acnologia offered a smirk and said his name with a nod, Natsu. You're still you. And it was more than enough. Anxeram's white eyes flashed furiously and he raised his hand towards Zeref, black energy gathering in his palm, and Zeref blinked in shock, staring in surprise at the gathering energy in the palm of the god as it was pointed to his head. A smile appeared on Zeref's face and he looked at Natsu. I'm glad we met, Natsu, despite the circumstances. He looked relieved, relaxed, and his eyes were black, almost joyful. Natsu blinked, and before he could respond to the odd picture, Anxeram released the ball of black energy and it shot from his palm in a pillar of pure black that shot through Zeref's head like a bullet. The black wizard stumbled a step back from the force, his knees buckled under him and he fell backward, a dull thud as his body hit the floor. A smile was still on his face, a round hole on his forehead, and blood pooled around his head like a halo. And just like that, Zeref was dead. When he was a child, Acnologia had thrown him into a cave and closed the entrance behind him. A demon had been inside, laughably weak in retrospect but dangerous beyond reason to his child self. He had barely started using magic at that point, only some sparks and wisps twisting between thin fingers. And he remembered the terror, the fear and anger at the situation, and the need to impress Acnologia that had been a living thing in him. And that need was what eventually led him outside a week later, the demon in the cave dead. Acnologia had waited on the other end, a look on his face that betrayed nothing and the annoyance in his tone as he told him he was too slow and that he was ready to leave him in that cave had it taken him any more time. Natsu wondered why he suddenly remembered that as he stood side by side with Acnologia, the two so close he could feel the heat radiating off of the king's skin. Anxeram looked livid, white eyes glowing in the black emptiness of his face, and if he had nostrils Natsu thought they would be flaring. The god wordlessly raised his hand to the sky and the two dragons stared as a spear of black energy shot from his hand and then burst above them like water hitting a rock, swirling down around them like thick tar. A dome of black swirling curse spread around them seamlessly, closing the three into what could very well be their own little world. The sudden silence that followed made Natsu realize how loud the world around them had been and he shivered at the wrongness of the dark dome around them. Anxeram stared at the two, white eyes wide and still glowing, and Natsu knew that they were trapped. Trapped with an angry, vengeful god. He didn't need to check the void to know it wouldn't answer. Acnologia didn't bother either, simply cursing under his breath, never taking his eyes off of Anxeram. I am done playing games, about fucking time, Acnologia answered, and suddenly Anxeram stood in front of the king, hand already moving down to strike him across his jaw. Acnologia's eyes widened and the king leaned back, avoiding the punch by less than an inch, and Anxeram snarled, twisting mid-punch with agility and speed that should be impossible, raising his heel towards Acnologia's chest. With no time to move away, Acnologia braced for the impact, clenching his teeth. White fingers gripped his forearm and pulled him away from the kick, and Natsu was standing between the two suddenly, fingers splayed towards Anxeram, and an explosion of crimson spread between them. Anxeram flinched back as the crimson touched him before he cut through the air with his hand, a crescent of black following the movement, and Natsu found himself on the floor in the next beat, Acnologia pressing his head down as the crescent flew overhead and hit the ground behind them, cutting deep through the debris they stood on. The two were already moving to their feet when Acnologia lost the ground under his feet. Anxeram's fingers wrapped around his head and the god continued in the circular motion of his attack, slamming down the Dragon King into the rocky ground below. Acnologia, stunned momentarily, his vision swimming, reacted more on instinct than anything else as he kicked with his legs, black and blue magic splaying around him, and Anxeram pushed back with a final slam of the king's head, and in the next beat, Natsu stood in Anxeram's spot, crimson energy flying at the god from the Dragon Prince's mouth. Fuck, Acnologia muttered even as he pushed himself to his feet, a hand on his head and a handprint burned into the side of his face. He was moving before he even looked at the blood on his fingers as he lowered the hand from his head. Natsu's roar dodged, the god was suddenly in the air. Still for a breath before black tendrils of curse arched from his back, embedding into the ground a foot deep, and the two dragons were forced to move, nearly faster than they were able to avoid them, and by the time the barrage stopped Anxeram was already there, standing a foot away from Acnologia, fingers forced together into a sharp point as he speared straight through Dragon's shoulder, missing his heart only thanks to Acnologia's quick reflexes. Natsu's eyes widened, the attack from before had forced them apart and he rushed forward, a wordless cry on his lips, and he snarled, baring his teeth as his teeth grew into fangs and the skin on his hands and feet turned into scales. Acnologia grabbed a hold on the arm lodged in his shoulder with one hand, the other quickly gripping the fabric on Anxeram's chest, and magic exploded from both parts, sending the god skidding backward with a barely audible gasp of shock. "You okay?" Natsu asked, reaching the two in a second even though it felt like an hour and he was moving already, pushing the god further back with a blast of crimson energy. Acnologia grunted in response, opening his mouth a beat later, a roar flying out of his mouth, twice as tall as he was. Anxeram planted his feet into the ground, a hand brought forward and the roar split in front of him like a wave on a cliff, and the next blast of crimson was split apart by another black crescent that nearly cut the Dragon King in half. The two dragons jumped back, trying to put some distance between them. Natsu took a deep breath, nearly panting, and he cursed. Looked at Metallicana with a raised eyebrow. "Watch your tone, Metallicana." The Iron Dragon managed to look sheepish for a brief moment but quickly sobered, eyes moving to Gajeel who was sitting on the ground, watching his broken legs slowly be pieced together. "You do you. I'll make sure we're safe." A sudden gust of wind went straight over them, strong enough to make the two dragons who were not in the hole completely blink and crane their necks, and they looked up to the source, eyes widening, and the mages tried to look over the edge unsuccessfully. "What's going on?" Gajeel demanded, trying to stand up only for Grandine to push him back down. Gray jumped up and over the edge, a burst of magic propelling him high enough, and he blinked, eyes and mouth wide open. "What is that? What is what?" Laxus yelled out, and Wendy stared up in worry, watching as Gray stared at something unseen. Gray paused, trying to find the right words. A black dome of some sort." "Anxeram," Grandine hissed through gritted teeth. A black dome of swirling black energy, sparking and twisting like a wildfire, stood in the distance, probably large enough to hold in a dragon 2 times the size of Acnologia. Laxus and Altair cursed, Wendy bit her lower lip, and Gray and Gajeel swallowed. Natsu. There was no doubt about it really. An almost literal eye of the storm. "He's gonna be fine," Gajeel said after a moment, far more confidently than he felt. "Yeah, he's gonna be fine," Gray agreed, eyes still fixed on the black dome separated by a virtual river of demons. It looked like an apocalypse. "He's Natsu. He's going to win this and it's all going to be fine," Wendy told them, moving away from Laxus and jumping up to heal Gray. She stopped short at the sight of the dome, before forcing her eyes away and focusing on Gray. "It's Natsu we're talking about. An Acnologia with him probably." Gentle as he picked Mira from the ground, gently cradling her in one large paw. The shock must have woken her up from the pain-induced daze, tear tracks on her dirty face devoid of new tears. Her voice was still strained, as she gripped Igneel's claw like the dragon might drop her. "No," she finally spoke through gritted teeth, and Igneel nodded, obviously not surprised by the answer. The dragon then looked at Carla and the cat nodded at the unasked question. "Yay, I'm fine. Just exhausted." Igneel nodded and then sighed heavily, glanced at the burned husk and then around them at the demons scurrying into the corners and under rocks like cockroaches in a wide radius around the king. "Let's go." He offered his other paw to Carla and the cat thankfully sank against the claws and the dragon lifted off. The two fairy tale members close together in the air looked at each other for a brief moment before Mira looked at Igneel, the two tightly held against his wide chest, barely even seeing the world around them speeding by. "We'll be all right," Carla repeated, and this time she dared to believe it. "Identify yourself," and the fact he didn't just blast a roar into the trees told Carla it was not demons. An assumption that proved correct when she saw Leon Vascha step out of the woods, hands and feet covered in scrapes, bruises and blood that told her the woods were full of demons. Sharia walked behind him, Uba and Jura a few dozen feet to their right, and several other members of Lamia's scale, scattered throughout the fringes of the woods, slowly making their way out, and it took Carla a moment too long to realize that the sight of a dragon might not be as welcome to them as it was to Fairy Tale. The fact they looked ready to fight Himmel made Carla nearly jump out of her own skin. "We are here to aid Fairy Tale, Dragon." Jura spoke but stopped as his eyes slid down to Mira, her glazed eyes staring back, and the mage shifted, squaring his shoulders. "What have you done to her?" Himmel's nostrils flared and Carla stepped in before it could get any worse. "He's healing her." Jura blinked, turning to her. "Carla. As the cat said, I am healing her. If you are here to help Fairy Tale, then I have no further objection to your presence. Proceed with your business." The mages didn't move at the clear dismissal, and Himmel's pale blue eyes flickered with annoyance. Uba spoke after another tense moment. "Leon, Sharia." The two looked at their guild master, You stay here and help them how you can. The rest of you, let us go. We have not come here to gawk. The mages scattered quickly after that, Jura looking somewhat unsure to leave 2 members behind. Himmel could relate. Leon blinked, somewhat lost before he glanced at Sharia, who forced a smile on her face, weak as it was. Can we do anything to help? How good is your healing? Sharia blinked, her mouth slightly opened before she spoke. You're a sky dragon. And you're a god slayer, Himmel stated, his tone suggesting stating the obvious was not what he had in plan. How good is your healing? He repeated, and Leon answered for her, she's great. Himmel eyed the ice mage for a brief moment before nodding, seeming satisfied. Heal who you can while I deal with the rest when more people arrive. Leave the serious cases to me. And me? Leon asked, swallowing. Stay out of our way. Leon's mouth snapped shut and he bit the inside of his cheek. Carla tugged his pants a moment later and his black eyes turned to look down at her. You can stand guard with me, she offered weakly, and if Leon knew how useless that was next to a dragon, he didn't say anything, simply nodding as his eyes slid to the forest they just came out of. Like fire, Natsu climbed to his feet, magic still dancing around him as he glared at the god. He wanted to look at Acnologia, to make sure his father was actually still alive, but he didn't dare turn his eyes away from the god. The sickeningly loud sound of bones cracking when the god's fist met Acnologia's chest still echoed in his head. He launched himself at Anxeram, pushing past exhaustion and pulling strength from sheer desperation, and wings exploded behind him in a shower of blood, long tail with the blade edge curling behind him as he spun in the air and did his best to cut the god in half with it, red magic still covering every inch of his skin. What is this? The fact he didn't know, the fact he genuinely looked disturbed by it, made something dark twist in pleasure in Natsu. If Natsu had to guess what this was, well, E.N.D came to mind. Me, he said instead. A look of disgust crossed Anxeram's face and he was gone. Still too fast for Natsu to truly follow, but he at least managed to see it coming, magic and curse amplifying his senses so much it was nearly painful. He blocked the kick, felt his bones crack, and they both pushed back, smoke rising from Anxeram's leg as he hissed and Natsu's arms throbbed painfully. As soon as Anxeram landed, Acnologia appeared behind him, a pillar of magic twice the size of the god appearing almost directly next to him, and the god was pushed back, unable to do much more than raise his hands. Acnologia stumbled as soon as the roar left his mouth, blood dripping down his chin, and Natsu looked at him in alarm, eyes moving from his pale face to the clear, unnatural concave the right side of his ribs made. Acnologia glanced at him, a smile working its way on his bloody lips and something that Natsu was pretty sure was pride appearing in his eyes. Since when are you stronger than me? Natsu's own lips twitched, something warm and pleasant spreading in his chest despite the situation, and the two turned to look at Anxeram as the god snarled at the two and shot himself at Acnologia. The Dragon King moved to dodge, Natsu rushed forward, and Anxeram reached the king. It happened far too quickly and Natsu still felt like he was watching in slow motion as Anxeram's hand tore through Acnologia's side. The momentum made the Dragon King fly to the side, crumbling through the air like his strings were cut, a spray of blood following behind him. An inhuman screech tore through Natsu's throat unbidden, echoing in the dome and shaking the ground as his magic exploded around him, and he reached Anxeram a moment later, hands wrapping around the black throat. He ignored the way his skin blistered and peeled at the touch, focusing completely on Anxeram's own screech of pain that left the god as the red energy seemed to seep into the darkness of his skin. You will never win, hissing through gritted teeth, a better portion of her lower body missing, Lilith was sure she painted a pathetic picture. Skiadram raised a bored eyebrow at her, his clawed hand pinning what was left of her to the ruined ground. I might have taken that more seriously if you could stand. Anxeram will kill you all, she said instead, trying to spit blood at the dragon only for it to dribble down her chin. She grunted as the claws pushed deeper. She looked at the Skiadram's red eyes, wondering, not for the first time, what was she doing here? He can try, Wislegia spoke, so sure in himself that Lilith wondered if they even knew who Anxeram was. He's a god, what do you think you can do? Plenty, Makarov spoke, walking up to her on unsteady feet. You underestimate us. I think you underestimate him, Lilith said, and she felt her lips tug up in a parody of a smile despite the pain. Her vision wavered, black spots becoming more numerous than the color around her, and even though she was pinned to the rock, one claw going straight through her, her legs missing, she felt dizzy almost like she was falling. I hope I'm wrong. She wasn't even sarcastic. She held no love for Anxeram, loyal through necessity rather than will. "You are," Sting informed her as if he was telling facts. Where did they get such conviction? How did these humans believe in themselves more than she believed in her own god? How are you so sure in that? She couldn't bother to hide her disbelief. Would she die or would she just be transported back to hell? She wasn't even sure what she would prefer at this point. The humans didn't respond immediately and neither did the dragons, exchanging looks and silent conversations that she had no strength to discern. Then they spoke in near unison. Natsu, Acnologia, the five looked at each other, a quick grim smile shared and Lilith blinked before a smile spread over her bloody lips. There was something to be said when these dragons and humans believed in the power of two half-dragons more than they did in the power of a god. She felt herself slipping. Well, I hope you're right. Skiadram watched as her eyes glassed over, staring emptily at him, and she stopped shivering and moving underneath him. The dragon pulled out his claw from her mangled corpse and looked at Weislegia and the humans. Huh, that takes care of that, quite, Weislegia replied quietly, yellow eyes falling on Sting and Rogue before trailing to Makarov. Why was she here? For a moment Makarov wanted to lie. It was a fairy tale secret, only passed down to the masters. He wanted to ask them to leave, grateful for the help, but now he needed to reach the Lumen Histoire before he was too late. But lies were partially to blame for their current situation, and lying now, after everything, made something ugly twist inside him. So he told them, and he wasn't sure why it surprised him when the dragons helped dig it out from underneath the ruins of the guild. Stepping off of Acnologia's back, dazed from the suddenness of the last few blows and another hole in him, the dragon prince blinked slowly, staring first at the black ceiling, and then turned to Acnologia as the king once again moved to stand up. The two locked eyes together, blue and red meeting for a brief moment, and Natsu suddenly wished to just stay down. He was so tired, so exhausted, and he could see it mirrored in Acnologia's tired features. There was something in Acnologia's eyes, something he wanted Natsu to know, to hear, but before he could respond, Anxeram grabbed his ankle and dragged him away from Acnologia and threw him through the air to the other side of the field. He tried to push his unresponsive feet beneath him as he saw Anxeram once again standing above Acnologia, the king doing his best to stand up as well. Anxeram made a disgusted, furious sound and kicked Acnologia in the head. Natsu was pretty sure his heart stopped for a second as Acnologia's head snapped to the side and the king crumbled to the ground like his strings were cut. Acnologia, Anxeram's head snapped towards him, eyes wide with something other than fury, and he disappeared again. Did you really think you can win? Anxeram was above him already. Natsu didn't even have time to stand up. The god grabbed his wrist as Natsu raised his arm, trying to throw a punch, and the magic around his hand disappeared at the cold touch of the god. The obsidian skin cracked as it came in contact with his magic, smoothing over moments later as he gripped Natsu's wrist tighter, and Natsu gasped, feeling frostbite spreading over his wrist, skin purpling under the impossibly cold touch. I am a god. With each word, he twisted his wrist further before with the final word he twisted it and Natsu felt the bone splinter and break. He twisted in the grip, aware of the scream that left him as he raised his tail and tried to bat the god away from him. Anxeram's response was a quick, sharp gesture of his hand, black magic snapping out of him like a whip, and Natsu felt his eyes widen, staring almost stupidly at the better half of his tail that lay twitching several feet away, blood gushing from the stump attached to him. I told you I will ruin you. I will tear you apart, piece by piece, and then I will reduce to nothing. You won't even die. You will just become nothing. Anxeram knelt above him even as he tried to sit up again from where he lay on his back. One hand grabbed his shoulder, purple bruising spreading over the exposed flesh immediately, and the other grabbed the bone of his wing, and Natsu had a moment to realize what followed before Anxeram released a blast of magic from his palm, creating a sizable hole in the limb that now hung limply only by the skin that spanned between the bones. A shriek tore from his throat, only intensifying when Anxeram grabbed the broken limb and proceeded it off completely, before he wrestled him again into his grip and repeated the process with his other wing, managing to make an even bigger mess with it than he did with the first. Igneel didn't look happy. If anything, he looked ready to further argue. A shriek followed by another howl, louder than any he heard from the dome since it formed, pierced through the air, loud enough to be heard even by the humans without the dragon senses, heard over the shrieking around them. The painful sound only intensified as the frozen moment shattered and Igneel shot off the ground like a bullet, speeding towards the dome. He didn't need to look at the humans to know they mirrored his horrified expression. Maybe he never heard that sound leave Natsu's throat, but there was no doubt the shriek came from him. The howl he didn't recognize, but he dared to hope it came from Anxeram. The sound cut off suddenly and Igneel felt his heart stop as he slammed bodily into the dome, only to bounce back as if nothing happened. He stared at the swirling tar-like mass, eyes wide as he prayed to hear something from the inside. He could hear Metallicana flying behind him and the Iron Dragon landed a moment later, the humans jumping off of his back and rushing to the dome. Acnologia, Igneel felt himself dip in the sky, missing a beat with his wings and the 5 underneath him froze as well. It sounded like Natsu, but the voice didn't sound like it came from the dome, it sounded like it came from all over, from nowhere, and from directly in his head. It sounded like another shriek, blood-curdling and somehow even louder than the first one, echoing in his head, impossibly loud. And just as it started to dip, to quiet, it came back with vengeance and Igneel thought he might be sick. What the fuck was going on in there? He didn't even realize he was preparing a roar until the searing heat of his own flames blasted across the dome. Acnologia blinked, head too heavy to even move, muscles not responding to anything, and all he could do was twitch as he tried to move. His ears were ringing, blood rushing so loudly he couldn't hear anything as he tried to focus his eyes on the ground several inches away from him. He didn't wonder what was happening or where he was as he woke up, the knowledge of it slammed into him before he even knew he was awake. Which was why he was desperate to get a hold of himself, force himself to hear and see what was happening. When his ears stopped ringing, he wished he had the strength to pull his own ears off. The focusing of his vision didn't help him any either. Blue eyes stared at the red sprayed everywhere and he knew part of it was there from the fight before and he couldn't help but pray that most of it was his, even though he knew that wasn't the case as he looked at the scene in front of him. What he would give to be able to fucking move. Natsu lay on his side, shredded back facing Acnologia, and Anxeram stood above him, black obsidian, solid skin pressing black marks into Natsu's skin as the god proceeded to break each finger on an already clearly broken hand. And the sound. Acnologia feared he might never be able to hear anything ever again. He had never heard Natsu scream that much, throat already raw as he jerked, and the dragon prince still somehow tried to fight the god who batted away the increasingly weaker strikes like annoying flies. And every time there was a flash of red magic from Natsu, the god twisted the already broken bones further. Acnologia fought with all that he had, trying to push himself to his feet, trying to run towards his son, and all he ever managed was to twitch his fingers and an occasional jerk of his legs. Pathetic. Anxeram moved again, stepping onto a blackened shoulder and pushing Natsu onto his abused back, broken remnants of his wings scraping against the ground. Natsu's head lolled almost lifelessly towards Acnologia as the dragon prince jerked and once again tried to twist free of the black hands. Acnologia stared at the red eyes, at the swollen flesh, and at the cut that ran from the corner of his mouth and across the scar that ran over his eye, nearly to his ear, making a mockery of a grin stretching his face. Red eyes blinked, dull and somehow still furious before they met his own, and Natsu's breath hitched, making the blood that's been pooling in his mouth drain out. Acnologia didn't even realize he was crying, staring at the broken body of his son, unable to do anything. Natsu stared back, red eyes suddenly and completely lucid and clear despite the mind-numbing pain he must be in the corner of his mouth that wasn't ruined twitched in a small reassuring smile. "Since when are you stronger than me? He told you that Lumen Histoire was Fairy Tail's greatest weapon. It's the last line of defense. Connected to Fairy Tail's master, Natsu now," Mavis said as she stood in front of the crystal where Makarov was before the dragons pushed him away, unperturbed by the blinding light. "My body was inside, serving as a catalyst, storage for the power. Fairy Tail's light and its darkness. The essence of a god. Released from one container, now moving to the other. Let's just hope we weren't too late." Skiadrum and Weislegia could only stay silent in mute shock. These humans created a god. I should have done this months ago," Anxeram snarled, holding a severed hand in his clenched fist before he threw her away with a wet squelch. Natsu didn't even scream, just a choked sound escaping his raw throat. Acnologia fought to stay awake, having lost consciousness twice already since he woke up the first time. The Dragon King heard Igneel on the other side, heard Metallicana and the Fairy Tail mages as they all tried and failed to break through their prison. He knew they would die as well, will die as well when Anxeram finishes with them, but he still wanted them to succeed in tearing down the dome. Maybe. just maybe, Natsu would be able to get out of this. Acnologia knew that wouldn't be the case. Could see the blood, so much blood, could see that Natsu only twitched anymore, eyes still terrifyingly clear through it as he fought to keep his eye contact with Acnologia. Like that was some comfort. How did he find comfort in Acnologia after everything he did to him? The Dragon King did not know. But if staying awake and watching him, keeping his eyes on him was helping, then he will do it. It was all he could do now, anyway. The sound suddenly cut off, and for a brief second Acnologia thought he had gone deaf. But this silence was loud. The white noise deafening in its entirety, and a white pillar of pure energy slammed through the dome as if it wasn't even there. It wasn't any bigger than his fist, and Acnologia watched as Anxeram jumped back from Natsu, the white slamming into his concave chest. The Dragon Prince's eyes widened at the contact, back arching and mouth opening in a silent scream. If his throat was too raw to make a sound, or if it was the deafening noise of the energy that made it impossible to hear, Acnologia did not know. Maybe it was his own blood rushing in his ears. What fresh hell was this? No one would blame you, Mavis said, you've done enough. More than enough. Natsu released a bark of laughter, derisive and hateful. I didn't do shit. People still died. People still got hurt. You can't save everyone, Mavis said, frowning, and Natsu looked away. I know. Do you? Natsu didn't respond to that. Instead, he sighed, turning to look at Acnologia's frozen image. The two of them really painted a sad picture now. I'm not dying here. Gallifrey offered a sad smile at that, nodding his great head like he didn't really expect anything different. And he probably didn't. Red eyes turned to the white light piercing his chest a few feet away from him. What exactly will happen to me? And maybe it would have been logical to ask that before you agreed. But the answer won't change his decision, he knew that much. Mavis and Gallifrey knew that as well, because neither tried to change his mind. If you were an ordinary mortal or a dragon, I would say it would kill you, Gallifrey told him bluntly, but you are not. You are a part of every world, of the mortals, of the dragons, and of the gods already. Great, it won't kill me, Natsu said, voice flat. When Gallifrey paused, it will give me powers of a god. Yes, Mavis spoke up, and no, it will unlock your full potential and amplify your gifts. You will only be able to survive this because you are already capable of it. Sword-like key in his hand. The blade of Anxeram. He felt a smile tug his lips upwards, and he lifted his head to look at Anxeram, nearly laughing as the god all but flinched. He twisted his grip on the blade, picking it up by his thumb and forefinger, and when he was certain that the god saw what he was holding, he once again fully gripped the damned blade and stabbed the air with it. Anxeram rushed forward, and it struck Natsu that he had no trouble seeing every footstep of the god as he rushed towards him. No, but for once, Anxeram was the one who was too slow, and Natsu twisted the key and the world seemed to lurch in its place, tipping sideways for a moment before it straightened and the hole in the sky shuddered. Anxeram stopped, staring wide-eyed as his handiwork collapsed. Natsu looked up as well, both eyes sharp and hale, and watched as the rest of the Supreme stared down at him from the edges of hell. No, 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 no. The Dragon Prince watched as the hole closed. The demons he could see flying through the air screeched and started falling, turning into dust before they even touched the ground. The hole snapped shut with a sizzling hiss, like a wound closed with fire. Anxeram stared at the red sky, eyes wide and disbelieving, breathing like an angry bull before his head snapped to Natsu. What have you done? He wasn't sure if it was the newfound power or the fact he was done with this shit that made him so calm in the face of that kind of fury. The first blast the god sent his way missed him completely as he dodged, and the area to his right exploded in a mess of swirling black that obliterated anything that was in it. Natsu looked around, remembering that Acnologia was there, and so were Igneel and the others, and there wasn't the black shield between them now. He twisted out of the way of Anxeram's next attack, rushing forward and grabbed the god by his wrist before twisting and sending him flying through the air good several hundred feet away from them. He knew it wouldn't be enough even before he heard Igneel and Metallicana spreading their wings to follow the two as he shot after Anxeram. Stay away. He was surprised the two actually listened even as he heard the humans protest. He reached Anxeram, the god already on his feet, as he sent a spell his way. He twisted as he ran, fingers spreading in front of him, and Anxeram's spell struck him, breaking on his palm like a wave on a cliff and disappearing around him like dust. When the black dome shriveled out of existence, Igneel thought his emotions might give him whiplash with the speed it went from relief to worry to confusion to horror. Natsu and Acnologia looked dead. He was certain they were until he managed to catch sight of the stuttering breaths that left Acnologia on Natsu's desperate writhing and grasping at the ground as the white light seemed to pierce straight through him. What was going on? The light intensified, hiding Natsu from view. As suddenly as it appeared, the white disappeared with a final flash and a shockwave that sent the dust flying around the Dragon Prince. The Fire Dragon King stared at what he knew was Natsu. But it was hard to believe that. A humanoid figure in Natsu's ruined clothes stood in Natsu's spot. Skin replaced by swirling crimson, facial features muddled and nearly lost in the swirling texture, dark red, nearly black, crossed over the skin, marking where his scars were, connecting them in an odd, macabre design. There was no hair on his head, just as marred by the dark red as the rest of him. Two pure white eyes that seemed to glow faintly stared at his hands, and then Igneel saw what was in them, eyes widening even further. And then Anxeram moved and Natsu moved, and how were they so fast? And what was going on? They needed to help. He couldn't just let him fight the god alone. Stay away. He felt himself freeze, unable to move closer even if he wanted to. He saw Metallicana stopped as well, the mages on their back protesting but also not moving, and Igneel blinked, eyes once again wide. Why did you stop? Urza demanded, but she didn't move from where Metallicana placed her on the ground. He needs help. We'd just be in the way, Jellal said through clenched teeth, as if pushing out that sentence physically hurt him. Urza imagined it did. It gave her own stomach a sharp flip. He was right. They looked at Natsu just in time to see him dispel Anxeram's attack like it was nothing. What happened to him? Gray muttered, unable to tear his eyes away from the Dragon Prince. Weird fucking shit, came Gajeel's answer. Gray sent him an unimpressed look, mouth open to respond, when Igneel interrupted them both with a sharp intake of breath. Acnologia, Grandine appeared, wide eyes staring at the Dragon King. Anxeram's white eyes flashed in a mad rage, and the god sent another spell towards him, and the Dragon Prince dodged, a moment too late, seeing the wide grin that spread over his lips, and Natsu felt his eyes widen, spinning on his feet to look as the spell slammed straight into Igneel's back as the fire dragon moved to shield the rest. Nostrils flaring in rage, vision red, he turned to Anxeram with an inhumane screech, jumping straight through the void to reach him sooner, and slammed a fist into the god's face, feeling the obsidian skin crack under it. Magic flared to life around him again, and his anger nearly choked him. Igneel, Acnologia, Ultir, Arthur, Mira, Lily, Gajeel, Laxus, Annie. Each name brought another blow from him, driving his fists into Anxeram, blood-red magic flaring out of him, creating an outline of wings and horns. He was kneeling above the god, beating him literally into the ground. The stone floor cracked beneath them and they fell through another underground room, but this time he didn't let go of him even as Anxeram tried to wriggle his way out. How many more hurt? How many more are dead? So much senseless destruction. For what? For one god's greed. Anxeram managed to wrestle one hand free and raised it to try and spear him with a spell. Natsu snarled, baring all his teeth, and snapped his arm down, red arch leaving the tips of his fingers, and the arm fell away from the body with a dull thud. Wide-eyed, Anxeram looked at his lost arm, and Natsu's eyes widened, snarl twisting in a mockery of a grin. Payback is a bitch. He clasped his hands together, bringing them both to the top of Anxeram's head, feeling black skin crack and give, leaving an indent in his head, one glowing white eye gone as black tar leaked out. Curse you, you already did. Another blow, and Anxeram tried to twist him around, raising his legs underneath him, and Natsu leaned back, grabbing the front of Anxeram's shirt with one hand and lifting him up before slamming another fist into his face, cracking his jaw. Anxeram twisted again, his magic bubbling under his skin, and the god released a screech as black magic exploded around him again, and Natsu was forced to let go. Anxeram jumped to his feet and shot out of the hole before Natsu could respond, and he looked as Anxeram stood at the edge, magic gathering between his palms, one remaining eye wide in mad desperation. He knew where that attack was aimed. And he wasn't going to let that happen. His throat started glowing red as he took in a deep breath, and just as Anxeram was ready to release his spell, he released his roar. Anxeram disappeared in the red light, his own spell exploding in his own hands as a roar twice the size of Acnologia washed over him. Natsu himself was lifted from his feet from the shockwave, slamming into the wall of the room he was in, vision dark from the spell and the dust that raged above him for a moment before he blindly moved, jumping towards Anxeram. He stood above him as the dust settled. The god lay on the ground, the better part of his right side gone, black tar leaking out of the crimson-tainted wounds. His one eye stared above at the red sky and he opened his mouth when Natsu landed, not turning to look at him. I am, impossible. Natsu stared at the broken god, silent. Black tar trickled down his lips, the surface of his skin cracking and the sharp edges disappeared into his original form, obsidian trailing into dust. Red lines sneaked through his skin like poison in veins. I lost, not soon enough. Natsu turned his palm towards the god, the single white eye still staring at the red sky. A ball of crimson formed slowly. He released it and a thin pillar of red shot through Anxeram's forehead, the gurgling of his breath falling silent, the glow of his eye dimming until it disappeared completely. He stared at Anxeram's corpse, silent, and finally turned his eyes away from the dead god to his hands. The red swirling energy started receding, like sand blown away by the wind, revealing his familiar pale, scarred skin underneath. The red sky above him brightened, the red bleeding away into a pure blue. It was over. Exhaustion that hit him came as a surprise and his knees buckled underneath him, a faint, surprised sound escaping his throat as he started falling toward the blood-stained ground. He watched as the ground rapidly grew nearer only for two strong arms to wrap around him and he blinked as he felt both himself and the person holding him slide down to the ground. I'm so proud of you, Natsu, Acnologia told him and he felt his eyes begin to slide shut, relief at hearing that voice adding to the tiredness of the exhaustion. Get some rest, kid. Why, exhaustion, apparently. Acnologia was starting to consider grabbing him by the shoulders and shaking him until he woke up. From the frown on Ultir's face, he had a feeling he wasn't alone in that thought. How long do you think he's gonna stay like that? Arthur asked when the silence stretched for several minutes, everyone starting to worry. Ultir scoffed, like they haven't already been worried sick. To worry more, Arthur amended and the woman sighed, shrugging, I don't know. She walked closer to the bed, fingers wrapping around Natsu's palm. She reached out, brushing away a few loose strands from his face that Acnologia had been staring at for several minutes now. He wished the two would leave, selfish as that thought was. A soft smile crossed Ultir's face and she squeezed his hand lightly. You better wake up before Mira because that woman will beat you black and blue for worrying us all like this. Arthur shifted in his seat, looking away from Ultir and into a corner of the blanket that covered the dragon prince from the waist down. Acnologia didn't really remember his mother, nor did he really understand in what relations Arthur and Mira were, but he could imagine a reminder that Mira was still unconscious did nothing for his mood. Then again, she wasn't in any danger of dying either, so there was that. Lost in thought, he at first didn't even notice the soft gasp Ultir let out until Arthur looked up, eyes wide and startled. Acnologia blinked, shooting out of his seat to get a better look at Natsu. The dragon prince's fingers wrapped tightly around Ultir's hand, squeezing almost painfully before he gasped softly, eyes scrunching. Natsu. Acnologia didn't even realize he said something, his own voice foreign to his own ears. Natsu's nose scrunched in a frown and his eyes moved behind his eyelids and then he released a breath Acnologia didn't even realize he was holding and his eyes slowly blinked open. The three gaped at him as the tired, unfocused gaze moved from one face to another before settling on the ceiling of the tent. Hello. His voice was hoarse from disuse and no doubt dry as a desert but there was a wry edge to his lips, a smile that persisted despite how tired he obviously still was. Acnologia heft out a laugh and Ultir's was near hysterical along with Arthur's. Acnologia stared at Natsu's eyes, unable to tear his eyes away. Human, white sclera and black iris with a sharp, snake-like pupil. Eyes he hadn't seen on Natsu's face since he was a child. Natsu must have noticed he was staring because he turned his head away from his conversation with Ultir and Arthur as the two continued to talk and the dragon prince looked at him, searching his face and after another moment of silence between the two he spoke, Are you alright? Acnologia blinked at the question before he scoffed, unable to stop a grin that stretched his face even if he wanted to. Yeah, I'm fine. A lifetime ago it was him who lied in the bed and her who sat beside him, waiting for him to wake up after that disaster in the tower. Natsu blinked, black eyes moving away from the pale sheets to the wall of the large tent. He didn't know what made him think of that. He shifted in his sit, standing up, aware he probably looked more like a gargoyle than a person at this point with how he sat on that chair unmoving for the last several hours. It would explain why the rest of the tent occupants avoided his corner of it like plague. He looked away from the tent and down the length of the tent. Nearly 24 other beds occupied it from his corner to the opening on the other side. Both fairy tale mages and mages from other guilds occupied the beds and Natsu looked away, back to Mira who didn't so much as stir. 2 days. 5 really since he, himself was unconscious for the first 3. Himmel and Grandine did what they could and now all that was left to do was wait. Natsu liked to think he had some semblance of patience. It was wearing thin right now though, making him rather unpleasant to be around. Another reason why even in a crowded tent full of healing people, none dying thanks to the 2 dragons and Wendy and Sharia, he was left alone. A hand snaked around his waist and a warm palm rested on his hip and he blinked, looking at Altair. He knew she was there behind him for the last few minutes. He might have been lost in his own thoughts but not enough to lose touch with his surroundings. The time mage rested her head on his shoulder, the height difference between them not enough for that to be comfortable but he didn't shrug her off nor twist out of her hold, instead placing a palm over her hand on his hip and he turned his head to the side, placing a somewhat awkward kiss on her head. He could feel how she shifted, feeling the surprise she felt at his actions. A part of him suddenly felt guilty that she was this surprised over such a small show of intimacy but he knew that there was no reason she should feel any different. It's not like he gave her any reason to. The moment of shock passed as quickly as it came and she leaned more heavily into his side, eyes on Myra's still form. "Are you alright?" She broke the silence after a while. Natsu huffed a soft breath, ready to tell her what he told everyone else. "I'm fine." But he stopped himself because Altair deserved more than that. He was fine, it was true. But he also knew she wasn't asking if he was fine physically. At least not only that. "I will be." That wasn't much better than, "I'm fine," but she seemed to accept that as an adequate answer. A moment later she stepped back and Natsu looked at her, his side cold without her pressing against him. She nodded her head to the chair he sat in until recently as she spoke. "Sit down." Natsu blinked, not sure what to make of the sudden command. "Is something wrong?" Altair's lips twitched in a smile even as she rolled her eyes. "No, I just..." "Sit down, okay." He did, almost reluctantly as he watched her walk behind him. He tensed involuntarily when he felt her hands on his shoulders and Altair huffed behind him, gently turning his head back towards Mira. "Relax, will you? I'm not going to stab you in the back," she joked as she started twisting her fingers over the tense muscle. He nearly laughed at that but it died somewhere on the way out of his throat and all that left him was a fast release of breath out of his nose. "I know. Yeah, I'd be worried if you didn't know that." He turned his head back up, tilting his chin up and Altair quickly leaned down, lips brushing against his. "Can I get a kiss as well?" Natsu leapt out of the chair, standing by Myra's bed faster than Mira even finished the question and Altair's hand stayed in the air for a moment longer before she walked over to the white-haired mage as well. She was sitting up unsteadily, expression twisted in pain but she wrapped her hands around Natsu's shoulder, relaxing as soon as the dragon prince sat down and she leaned against him, letting him support her weight. Altair sat next to Natsu and Mira untangled one hand from his neck, pulling Altair into the hug as well. It was an uncomfortable position for pretty much all involved but no one bothered to move. The tip of his boot sends a loose pebble flying and his eyes stray away from the road ahead to the pebble as it rolls several feet down the road, stops on the edges of it, and then tips over into the river below. He doesn't say anything. Why would he mention a falling pebble or the way that water underneath rippled in soft circles? Yet he feels oddly detached from his surroundings, eyes still trained on the edge where the pebble last stood on the road. Maybe the fault of his detachment was his surroundings, to begin with, but he looked away from the pebble soon enough, not even pausing in his stride as he continued the tragic march down the road. There was something to be said about Altair's time magic. 3 weeks ago Tartaros and demons all but razed it to the ground and now Magnolia stands whole as if nothing happened at all. The old buildings were there, Magnolia looked whole, but it wasn't. Her population was decimated in the span of a few hours and those that weren't killed, well, most left. And Natsu couldn't blame them. But despite it becoming nearly a ghost town in the span of a day her streets were full now, people walking in a line as a black, mournful river with fairy tale at the front and Natsu in front of them all. He didn't like it, not particularly feeling like his efforts needed to be so obviously singled out. But others didn't care about his own opinion and he didn't have the energy to argue about something that will, in the end, be forgotten. No one really paid attention to who was the person walking in front of the funeral. People, if they weren't crying, were paying attention to the coffins. And there were so many. Natsu swallowed dryly, knowing that right behind him 6 people carried Annie's coffin. He tried to ignore the fact he would much rather do that than what they wanted him to do, but he didn't delve on it too long, forcing himself to look back ahead to the road. Whoever thought that he was adequate at holding a speech for something like this was going to be disappointed. He wasn't really sure why he was surprised to see him here. The other man looked as surprised as Natsu himself felt as he looked at the pink-haired dragon prince. Gildarts looked bad, not that Natsu could blame him. He hadn't shaved in a while, shoulder-length hair falling in greasy strings over his sunken face and the dark circles under his eyes looked more like bruises than results of sleepless nights at this point. It's been months since he saw the man. The last time was sometime before Grand Magic Games. Gildarts' absence didn't bother him. The two knew each other well enough for that to bother them. If anything, Natsu understood the need for some solitude from time to time. He just found it in different ways, here in Magnolia rather than traveling to the other side of the continent if not leaving it entirely. From the look on Gildarts' face, the mage regretted it. The guilt of not being here during all this was probably crushing him, a terrible monster rearing its head behind him at all times. Natsu didn't even dare to imagine how that would feel. He felt guilty enough over not doing enough. He couldn't imagine what he would feel like if he hadn't been here at all. It's not your fault. No one is blaming you. The dragon prince looked Gildarts into his eyes, making sure the other mage looked back. Those were the first words he spoke since the two saw each other. And he knew they wouldn't fix anything really. But he needed Gildarts to hear them more than the mage needed to hear some pleasant greetings. The tense line of his shoulder didn't really ease, but some of the shadows in his eyes seemed to lift. Like he needed to hear someone say that. He probably did. The redhead nodded after a moment of silence. To what he nodded Natsu wasn't sure because he didn't think it had anything to do with what he said. The two stayed silent as they looked down at the headstone they stood above in Magnolia's cemetery. Kana Alberona, beloved daughter, devoted friend X766 X791. I'm blaming me. Natsu blinked, looking up at the man. His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't used it in a while, or maybe like he had been screaming or crying. Or all three of those. And it took Natsu a moment to realize Gildarts was referring to Natsu's earlier statement. You shouldn't. The mage once again fell silent long enough that Natsu thought he wouldn't say anything else when he spoke up again. I could tell you the same thing. Natsu didn't hesitate in his response. You could. He placed the candle underneath the headstone, straightening his back and sighing as he did so. It was the middle of the night and he should be sleeping. But he didn't feel tired. Not in that sense. Not since he woke up from that 3 days long sleep. The flickering light of the candle did little to disperse the darkness around him, but it wasn't like he didn't see nearly as good as he did during the day even without it. The sky was dark, heavy, fat clouds hung low over it, and he knew it would rain, sooner rather than later. He could already hear the thunder clapping to the north, closer with each new strike of lightning. He also knew that the flash of lightning behind him had nothing to do with the weather. The newcomer stayed silent for one shocked second, and Natsu distantly wondered how he looked like to the man behind him, dressed in the tracks and shirt he used as his sleepwear, feet bare and hair out of any semblance of order. He also knew Laxus didn't particularly care about that. The shocked silence was certainly more a result of it being 3 in the morning than anything else. I didn't think anyone else would be here, Laxus finally spoke when it was clear Natsu had no intention to. The dragon prince shrugged, pulling out the second candle from his pocket and lighting it with a flick of his finger before he placed it near the headstone that stood beside the first one. Maybe it was the late, or really early, hours that made him say it. Maybe it was because it was obvious. Couldn't sleep. Laxus nodded behind him, and the fact that Natsu knew that made something uncomfortable flicker in his gut. Me neither, Laxus admitted softly, looking at the two headstones, the candlelight bouncing off of the stone and the carved names. Evergreen wonderful friend X764 X791 Bixlo, a true friend. X762 X791 Natsu stared at the graves. The urge to say, I'm sorry, was strong. He swallowed it. Laxus knew that. Laxus heard it before too. And he already told Natsu to not be. They wouldn't want him to be. You should get some sleep. Laxus' voice was hoarse when he next spoke, and they both knew that he wasn't saying that because he expected Natsu to go to bed. Natsu nodded, hearing the, I need to be alone, even though it wasn't spoken. Get some rest as well. he said instead, disappearing in the void like a ghost. One moment there, the next gone. Not even the whole opening to signal his leave. He and Max were never close. Really, if he wasn't looking at his headstone, he wouldn't even know his last name. He recalled he used some sort of sand magic, but he couldn't even truly recall what his voice sounded like. It made him sadder than he was willing to admit. Ritas, Droy, and Lackey as well. He knew them as members of Fairy Tail. As members of the guild. His guild, but not much else. As such he walked past their headstones, stopping only long enough to leave a candle and stare dejectedly at the stone as he tried to recall anything he actually knew about the four. Not that anyone could really tell there was anything but indifference going on in him. He always had a good poker face. He did stop by 2 graves further down the line, putting down another candle and flowers he brought on an already filled grave. The flowers that stood in front of each headstone were fresh, morning dew still clinging to them and not a sign of brown appearing on the petals. Lizana Strauss, a caring sister and a beloved friend. X767 X791 Elfman Strauss, a loving brother and a faithful friend. X766 X791 Breathing in, Myra's distinct smell filled his nose and he bit the inside of his cheek. She didn't mention she was going to the cemetery when she left the house an hour ago. Not that Natsu told anyone when he decided to come here. Partially because more often than not it was not planned, more an impulse that brought him here than any decision he might have made. 2 sets of footsteps tapped over the cobblestone and a moment later a flash of scarlet appeared in his periphery, followed by blue. Neither said anything, content to keep quiet for the time being as Urza bent down and left her own candle. Natsu wondered how much time will pass before they all start wandering into the cemetery at all times of the day. A while, probably. It never even occurred to me something like this could happen until it was all over. Urza's voice was soft as she spoke, leaning against Jellal, who looked up when she spoke and wrapped a hand around her waist, resting his palm against her hip. If they were anywhere else Natsu would have smiled. Good things could still happen. It was dangerous, and I knew we could all die, but, she paused, frowning as if she didn't know what she wanted to say herself. But everyone that was with us made it, so I thought. She trailed off again and neither Natsu nor Jellal said anything to that. There wasn't really anything to say to that. He wasn't really sure why it surprised him, but it did. Maybe it was because it was once again well past midnight and he expected the cemetery to be empty. The 2 seemed surprised to see him there too, and Natsu knew by now that part of that shock was due to the fact he looked like he rolled out of bed after hours of useless tossing around, which was the case, but he was not going to voice that. He padded barefoot closer to the 2, stopping several feet away to give them the privacy they probably wanted, and turned to one of the headstones that littered the Fairy Tail side of the cemetery. And the fact that Fairy Tail now had a side made something sharp twist inside. Levi and Gajeel, however, walked to him, both almost reluctant, like they were the ones intruding and not the other way around. They had been standing by Lackey's grave and Natsu wondered if Levi and Lackey were friends. Probably. Panther Lily beloved friend X758 X791 Lucy Heartfilia. A true friend X767 X791 staring at Lucy's name. Natsu couldn't help but remember when they met. He also couldn't help but wonder if she would still be alive if they didn't. A rabbit hole of what-ifs that would get him nowhere, he knew. But he still stood too close to the edge on some days. He expected the Dragon Slayer to say something. Maybe even Levi, though she rarely said anything in his presence for as long as he'd known her. But the 2 stayed quiet and Natsu felt no need to break the silence. It was only when he turned to leave that Levi spoke, and from the way Gajeel nearly jumped he didn't expect it either. Lou once told me that she wanted me to have her keys should anything ever happen to her. Said I'd know what to do with them. She spoke and Natsu watched as she placed a hand on her belt without even realizing it, keys slowly clinking together. I planned on giving them to Yukino. She uses them after all. Knows how to use them. Natsu wondered if this story had a point. He didn't mean it in a way that might be considered rude. He didn't mind listening to Levi talk about Lucy. In different circumstances, he was certain they would have been good friends, he and Lucy. Nothing he could do now about that, though. But then I managed to summon Plu, Levi continued, and Natsu blinked, turning to look fully at her even as the blue-haired mage kept staring at Lucy's grave. And I'd like to think this is what Lu meant when she said I'd know what to do with them. She seemed to suddenly be aware she was gripping the pouch containing the keys and her grip tightened, a sort of watery smile that neither Gajeel nor Natsu knew what to do with, tugging at her lips. Here, he tapped Asuka's head, and then moved his finger to her tiny chest, and here. I know, Asuka told him as she looked away, purple eyes looking ready to spill tears, and Natsu felt himself panic. Everyone keeps telling me that. Well, they are not wrong, Natsu spoke quickly, adding, whenever you meet someone you leave a part of yourself in them and they leave a part of themselves in you. The longer you know them and the closer you are, the larger parts of yourself you leave behind and larger parts you gain in return. That's how people grow. Pa says it's the vegetables. Asuka was frowning and Alzak was watching him wide-eyed. Natsu huffed something that might have been a laugh. Well, that too. But, well, as I was saying, that's how you grow, and that's how you know that a part of Bisca will always be with you. Another large part is with your pa, and that's why he's sad too. And I have it on good authority that there is an afterlife, so when you're old and gray you'll get to see her again. Asuka seemed to consider that for a long time, and Natsu wondered if he was being too abstract for a child her age. The kid nodded to herself, face serious as she looked at him. So we shouldn't be sad for too long because we'll see them again. Natsu blinked, a bit surprised to see that the child understood him, and he suddenly wondered how old she was. 5. You shouldn't be sad for too long then as well. Because when you're old and gray you'll see them too. Natsu's eyes widened slightly and his heart squeezed painfully in his chest. His expression crumpled and his breath caught in his throat. Alzak immediately reached for Asuka to give Natsu a chance to leave when the Dragon Prince tightened his hold slightly on her, forcing his lips to part in a grin. Yes, he swallowed, yeah. Of course, I will. He ignored the wetness on his cheeks. He also ignored the way Asuka was frowning at him and the look Alzak was giving him. The next time he appeared in the middle of the night, the cemetery was empty. He appeared in the entrance and walked to Annie's grave slowly, a bottle of whiskey in hand and a candle in the other. It's not like he could get drunk even if he tried, but it would give him something other to do than to stare at marble and let his thoughts run in circles. He sat down on the cobblestone in front of it, lit the candle, and tipped the bottle back. A few months passed at this point, he recalled idly as he swirled the bottle, looking at the cursive they used to write the name. Andrina Smith, beloved friend, daughter and sister X776 X791. Andrina Smith. Natsu couldn't remember when someone, if anyone, called her Andrina. It felt almost like an insult to her memory. Frowning for a moment before he relaxed his features, he tipped the bottle to the headstone, in something like a toast, and tipped it back again. It's been long enough that thinking about it all wasn't painful anymore. Or maybe not as painful. Not as sharp. A dull ache is what it was. A badly healed scar. The fact he was still coming to the graveyard in the middle of the night probably said a lot more about it all than anything else did. He also considered not acknowledging the footsteps that came right behind him and stopped nearly an hour and a half a bottle of whiskey later. I'd say this was not healthy, but I know you wouldn't listen, Arthur finally told him. You would be right about that, Natsu told him, moving slightly in his spot in a clear invitation, and Arthur didn't wait a second before he sat down. I'd say you shouldn't be wandering in the cemetery alone at night, but I know you wouldn't listen, Natsu told him after the silence stretched for several minutes. I'm not the one who keeps doing it, Arthur said, glancing at him with a raised eyebrow. I'm older than you, Natsu told him, like that was a valid reason. You're not really that much older than me, Pa, true enough. Arthur was 17 and Natsu 25, part of the reason why Natsu always felt more like an uncle to him than a father. The two fell silent until Arthur nudged him with his elbow, not a difficult feat since the teen was already half leaning against him. Natsu looked at him and Arthur's green eyes turned expectantly to the bottle in Natsu's hand. The Dragon Prince paused for a moment before he leaned slightly back and handed the bottle to Arthur. By the look on Arthur's face, the teen did not expect that. A huff that bordered on a laugh left Natsu's lips and he said, "Don't look so surprised, I'll take it back long before you can even start feeling tipsy." Arthur smiled into the bottle as he took a sip, gagging at the taste but still swallowing it. That's horrible. Of course it is. As it turns out, he didn't need to take it because Arthur handed it back without another word, sticking his tongue out. Why are you drinking that? It can't be for the taste, and I know you can't get drunk. Natsu considered that, taking another long gulp from the bottle. I don't know, he told him in the end. I'm sure there's some psychological reason Mira or Altair would be happy to tell us come morning. Arthur snorted at that, leaning more heavily against Natsu. Yeah, I bet they would be. Natsu shifted in his seat, turning so that Arthur would be more comfortable. You should be sleeping, Natsu told him, and Arthur hummed in agreement. Working on it, the teen told him, his head lolling to the side for a moment before he let it fall on Natsu's shoulder. Not on me, Natsu added, but didn't move to rouse him up. Arthur hummed again, tugging at his coat with the prosthetic hand and burying his head deeper into the collar of it. You're going to catch a cold, Natsu said, more to himself than to Arthur because he knew that the teen was going to ignore him again. Nah, Arthur told him, you're warm these days. He was asleep in the next minute and Natsu sighed, shifting gently to not wake him up as he gathered him in his arms, looking at the bottle left on the ground in front of Annie's grave. His eyes moved to Annie's name next and Arthur muttered something in his sleep. Natsu let himself smile, and the two disappeared seamlessly into the void. Arthur didn't even stir. Uncle to him, and maybe it's been months, but Natsu will never tell anyone how long they are allowed to grieve. But Romeo wasn't the only one who lost someone, and biting everyone who offered a hand was a sure way to end up starving. At least the teen had the decency to look like he realized what he said. But it wasn't enough to make him stop sneering at Natsu. What Natsu said next some would call tough love. Natsu called it annoyed. You're acting like a rabid dog, he told him, voice cold sharp, foregoing any pretense at being polite, turning to fully face the teen, and it was almost as if the kid only now remembered who he was talking to, shrinking in on himself. Part of him wanted to say, is this what Macau would have wanted, but that was a low blow and he was not nearly annoyed enough to say something that cruel. I lived for years pretending I wasn't bothered by emotions and all I got in return was an emotional range of a teaspoon. You don't want that and I would know because I lived it. Be smart enough to learn from others' mistakes. Not just your own. Romeo's chin was jutting out and there was still a mulish set to his jaw, but he stayed quiet. Because he didn't dare to say something or because he was actually thinking about what he said, Natsu didn't know. He did know he wanted to make his words stick. And okay, maybe he was annoyed enough to say it, you're not the only one who lost someone, but he dared to think it was warranted. And he was glad in the end he did say it because all the fight left the teen and he deflated like a popped balloon, folding into himself. I'm sorry, he finally said, and he sounded like he was. Natsu nodded, staring at him, and the teen looked away, refusing to make eye contact. So am I, Natsu said, apologizing for something Romeo probably wasn't even aware of. You shouldn't be, or maybe he was. Natsu didn't dare to delve into that, instead stepping back and motioning for Romeo to follow him. Let's go to the guild. It's far too cold outside for a cold-blooded lizard like myself. Romeo nodded, a tentative smile on his face. If he knew Natsu didn't feel the cold he didn't say anything, looking at the sky as the snow started to fall from the steel-gray clouds. It's been a while since he stepped foot in the cemetery, and that knowledge made him feel both light and heavy at the same time. In the end, he told himself he was healing. He liked to think they all were. He heard him before he saw him, which wasn't really telling much when the man in question didn't reach over all of the headstones. Makarov saw him coming and the old man nodded in greeting. He hadn't had any intention of stopping by her grave, but in the end, he did because Makarov looked like he needed some company. The relationship between them never really mended, but they were on amicable enough terms. And he didn't really hate the man. He just didn't trust him. I often wondered if, Natsu stopped him before he finished. Nothing good would come out of that question. What ifs were like a hydra. Once you let yourself delve into the first one, there will always be more, one replaced by two and two by four. Don't go down that rabbit hole. It doesn't lead anywhere good. The way that Makarov chuckled told him that ship sailed a long time ago. You're right, of course. Of course, Natsu said flatly, looking away from Makarov and down at the headstone in front of him. Perliuzica, a beloved friend X699X791, the Dragon Prince, looking at the name, realized with a jolt that, had it not been for Perliuzica, he probably never would have joined Fairy Tail. And despite everything, he suddenly wished he could thank her. For that at least. The two fell silent and Natsu was content to keep it that way. Makarov wasn't. I wanted to thank you. Natsu wasn't sure that's what he expected when the man broke the silence. It mirrored his thoughts strangely and left him feeling off balance. Thank me? For what? For, Makarov fumbled, obviously not prepared to explain himself. In the end, he shrugged and said, for everything. Unsure what to do with that information, Natsu nodded, stepping back. "Alright," he said to the older man, paused to see if Makarov wanted to say anything else, and when the man stayed silent, he walked away. A polished black statue in the shape of a fairy tale symbol stood before him. Every inch perfect, smooth and polished to the point he could see himself as if he was looking at a mirror. All cut from one perfect slab and made by the very best masons in Fury. A perfect, solid memorial to commemorate all fairy tale members that lost their lives on that day 7 months ago, their names written in beautiful cursive. Natsu hated it. It felt impersonal, cold, and the polished, obsidian black made him shiver when he saw his reflection in it, feeling the white eyes staring back at him from a black, shadowy face. He sighed, looking away to the guildhall he could see down the hill. He was alone out here. Or as alone as people left him these days. Everyone was in the guild just a few hundred feet away. Not nearly far enough for him to not hear them from this distance with no trouble if he felt so inclined. He didn't mind it. If anything, he was pretty sure he needed the feeling of their presence by now. He didn't tell anyone what happened in that last fight, didn't explain what Lumen Histoire has done to him, didn't mention Gallifrey or Mavis talking to him. And while he was pretty sure that those few last words he exchanged with Anxeram were heard by Igneel, Grandine, Metallicana, and Acnologia, 4 dragons, if they heard them, ignored them, or maybe better to say they didn't mention them. He doubted if they heard them, they truly ignored them. He said nothing to no one's questions, and so they stopped asking. He's pretty sure he never will say anything. But that didn't mean he distanced himself from them, feeling truly like he belonged for maybe the first time. Though now he sees he belonged in fairy tale, maybe not since the beginning, but for a long time nonetheless. It left him most days oddly weightless, and as the time passed since all that death and destruction, he felt something loosen in his chest, and he found himself smiling more, nearly grinning. He sighed again, eyes back on the perfect, beautiful memorial that made his stomach turn, and his eyes traced over the names, each one a personal failure that was becoming easier to bear, and as he came upon Annie's name his breath hitched and he bit the inside of his cheek to distract himself from the lump in his throat. He wasn't really a father to her nor to Arthur, barely acted like one, but they've taken to calling him that in those nearly 7 years he knew them. If he remembered correctly, it started as a joke because the siblings started calling Ultir and Mira moms, so Arthur reckoned he was the dad. That being said, he imagined that losing a daughter would hurt similar to this. But it was easier now than it had been all those months ago. Andrina Smith, he turned away from it, unable to stare at that smooth black surface and the names any longer, and he marched downhill towards the guildhall. He could hear the laughter inside, different, more subdued than it had ever been, but still fairy tale in a way that no mournful silence could ever be. They were getting better. They weren't quite there yet. Won't be for a while, he knew. But they were getting there. He opened the doors, a soft smile lifting his lips as he breathed in the scent of home, of family. "It is nice," Igneel spoke, voice hesitant as he and Acnologia stood in front of the memorial one early morning. The sun barely started rising, painting the sky in stripes of dark blue, pink, and yellow. As far as he could tell, no one was in the guild yet at this time of the day, which was partly the reason they were here now, but the 2 dragons currently standing in their human forms didn't even think that Natsu wouldn't know they had been here. Acnologia, without missing a beat, answered flatly. "It's dreadful. Natsu hates it." Igneel idly wondered if it was dreadful because Natsu hates it, or if Natsu hates it because it's dreadful. Looking at the memorial, he himself couldn't quite decide. The two fell silent and Igneel read over the beautiful, cursive text. "In loving memory of Panther Lily Lucy Hartfilia Canna Alberona. Evergreen Bixlo Lizana Strauss Elfman Strauss Perliuzica. Wakaba Mine Macau Conbold Bisca Connell Max Allers. Redis Jonah Droy Lackey Olieta Andrina Smith. Truly good friends are hard to find, difficult to leave, and impossible to forget." Interruption came in a form of a very ecstatic Gajeel who burst through the front gate with enough force to nearly rip them from their hinges. He stood there in the suddenly silent guild, the widest grin Natsu ever saw on his face. "I'm going to be a father." Natsu was not prepared for the explosion of sound that followed, but even with his ears ringing as much as they did, he was pretty sure in the resulting shout his was still one of the loudest. "It's gonna grow a lot more in the coming years, I think," Mira said, laughing, and Laxus nodded, grinning. It wasn't until well past midnight that Gajeel made his way to Natsu. A good portion of the guild passed out or too drunk to stand. Levy trailed behind him, the two holding hands as they avoided the sprawled members that no one bothered to move from the floor. They haven't really managed to talk before. Gajeel and Levi, the center of attention of the entire guild, and with every member ready to talk to them, Natsu was happy to sit back and wait until the things calmed down a bit. Natsu looked at the two, a glass of bourbon in his hand. He raised it when they were closer. "Congratulations, you two," Levi beamed at him, cheeks tinted pink, looking incredibly pleased with the situation. Gajeel was grinning as he took a seat next to him and nudged him with his elbow. "You trying to get drunk?" He tilted his head to the nearly empty bottle of the bourbon at Natsu's elbow, and the Dragon Prince gave an exaggerated put-upon sigh. "If only I could." Gajeel nodded solemnly in agreement before he proceeded to take the bottle from Natsu and raised it in a toast. Natsu eyed the stolen bottle with narrowed eyes before smirking and raising his glass, "To new parents." Gajeel grinned, raised his bottle, and Natsu was certain he waited for the Dragon Prince to take a sip before he spoke, staring at Natsu, "To the Godfather." Natsu choked on the bourbon, nearly spitting it straight into Gajeel. The struggle to not do that resulted in it dribbling down his nose, and he gasped when he managed to swallow it. Blinking at the watering of his eyes and the burn in his nose, he looked at Gajeel, who nearly fell over himself in laughter. He did his best to glare at Gajeel, but the Dragon Slayer's words did something weird to his insides, and the half-hearted attempt at the glare soon dissolved into a rather tentative smile. "Are you serious?" Gajeel snorted, and Levi quickly answered, "Of course. If you are willing, that is." The smile turned into a grin that was quickly mirrored by Gajeel and Levi. "Yes," he huffed a laugh, "I might be willing." Might be willing. Something about it made him laugh heartily. Or maybe it was more accurate to say it was the joy of the situation that was making him laugh. "Fuck," he gasped briefly when he stopped laughing, grinning from ear to ear and not even bothering to try and suppress it. "I'd be ecstatic." "Shoot," Mira muttered under her breath, staring at the small mirror in her palm, the other hand pinching a small lock of hair. Natsu blinked, shifting slightly in his seat to have a better look at her. "I think I'm going gray," she explained with a sigh as she waved her hand. The mirror disappeared with a poof of white smoke. He raised an eyebrow, hoping it conveyed the absurdity he felt at that sentence, and he must have done an adequate job because Mira huffed. "You've been gray as long as I've known you," Gray informed her from his own seat at the table. The ice mage hadn't even looked up from the menu, and either ignoring the glare Mira shot him or not noticing it, he continued, "And I've known you for almost 20 years now." The three fell silent for a moment at that, and then both Mira and Gray groaned. "Now I made myself feel old," Gray muttered unhappily. "And we're sitting in an actual restaurant. Frankly, it's not helping." "You're not old," Natsu told them flatly, because 30 was definitely not old and they were being unnecessarily dramatic. Gray opened his mouth, ready to say something that Mira deemed inappropriate because she elbowed him in the ribs. First, ouch, the ice mage glared at Mira, who blinked innocently back. He looked back at Natsu a moment later. Second, easy for you to say. Mira elbowed him again. "Stop that." "Stop what?" Natsu huffed a laugh as Altair looked at the three with a raised eyebrow, Juvia, own eyes curiously looking over them from where she stood behind the time mage. Gray was about to put his foot in his mouth. "I saved him from it," Mira told them in a matter-of-fact voice that had Gray spluttering. "I was not." Juvia grinned. "Knowing you, Juvia wouldn't be surprised if that was the case." Gray made a far too dramatic groan after that, clutching at his heart. "You too, Juvia." Natsu huffed another laugh, ignoring with practiced ease how everyone lit up at the sound like they never heard it before. Laughter still curving his eyes and lips, he looked at Mira. "You know, Mira, I'm not fragile." Altair took a seat next to him and Juvia sat next to Gray. "You're not," Altair agreed easily, her eyes sparkling mischievously as she turned to look at Gray, "but Gray is. And it's hard to scrape someone off of a wall." Gray blinked at her, before he scowled, pouted, and crossed his arms over his chest. "This is bullying. I am being bullied. Are you seeing this, Natsu? This is bullying. As the guild master, you should stop this." "Of course," he told him dryly and pointedly looked at his menu that sat on the table. Gray's mouth opened slightly and he blinked, before he laughed as well, unable to keep up the act any longer. Natsu was fairly certain he had never felt more ill at ease and more inadequate than he did in that moment. He didn't look ill at ease. His expression was a picture of confidence, and he was relaxed, and he. "You're not holding a wet tissue paper." Arthur's voice came straight from behind him, and the little shit had been trying to startle him for a better part of the year now. Needless to say, his attempts were unsuccessful but annoying. I am well aware of that. Mira was not wrong that there would be new members of the guild soon enough, Natsu mused as he looked back down at the newborn in his arms. The little human didn't so much as twitch in his hands, and Natsu had to admit he expected the baby to start screaming the second it was placed there. Yet here she was, sleeping peacefully. She's far more precious than wet tissue paper, Levi told Arthur with a laugh. Gajeel nodded, face grave like the conversation was deathly serious. Oh, give her here, Mira cooed, standing beside Natsu with her arms outstretched expectantly, and unexplainably Natsu felt his fingers tighten ever so slightly around the blanket. He looked down at the child for another moment before gingerly handing her over to Mira, at once feeling like he was allowed to breathe again. Altair cooed with Mira the second the two got their hands on the child, and Natsu looked at them, the scene searing into his memory. He was infertile, they knew that much. If it was a result of the dragonification, the more recent change, or if he was born that way was a mystery, but the fact remained. They will never have a child of their own. It didn't bother him as much as it probably would. He didn't think he would be a good father, but he knew the two women wanted it. As if reading his thoughts, Arthur draped a hand over his shoulder, the younger man several inches taller than him, and grinned at him. Natsu didn't even realize his lips parted before he was already grinning back. They won't have their own children, but blood had little to do with the family. Did you already decide on a name? Natsu found himself asking, looking at Gajeel and Levi. Levi looked almost startled by the question before she turned to look at him and her cheeks went red. Raising an eyebrow at the odd reaction, he turned to look at Gajeel, who was looking away, refusing to look at him, his own cheeks tinted red. The dragon slayer mumbled something, and now every eye in the room was on him. Natsu felt tensed. They wouldn't. What was that? Arthur asked, straightening, a smirk on his face. Lucy, Levi finally said, and Natsu barely restrained himself from showing the relief. Arthur laughed. With the way you looked at Pa, I thought you named her Natsu or something. Natsu shuddered. Levi laughed. No, it felt right. She's our little sunshine, and Lucy was a ray of sunshine as well. Gajeel nodded. It felt right. Natsu knew that Gajeel didn't really know Lucy all that well, but neither did Natsu, and he knew the two were right about Lucy having been surprisingly bright. A stubborn optimist, one could say. A fool, Acnologia would say. He chuckled at the thought, nearly voicing it before he thought better of it. Gajeel and Levi probably wouldn't be happy with him calling their child a fool. Mira cooed again, gentle fingers ghosting over the baby's face. The baby blinked at her, awake, and without a warning, the white-haired woman placed the baby back into Natsu's hands. That's your godfather, Lucy. Lucy blinked at him, scrunching her tiny nose in distaste, and Natsu laughed at that. Yeah, I know there's not much to look at. She blinked again before a big toothless smile spread over her lips. Natsu blinked at her, surprised by the sudden change in the demeanor, before smiling softly. Hey there, Lou. Urza had never been the one for subtlety, nor did her patience leave much to be desired. It was this and quite a few other things that should have told Jellal that this would happen. Natsu would lie if he said he wasn't surprised, but it was more because of the timing than the actual action. Urza had gone and knelt in the middle of the guild hall, decked in her best suit of armor, shined and polished, presenting Jellal with a box. Jellal sat right beside Natsu, so Natsu had no trouble seeing the man's face. He quite nearly lost it there and then. Good thing he had a lot of practice in keeping a straight face. Jellal had been dragging Natsu to this corner of the guild for days now, trying to plan a perfect moment to propose and asking the Dragon Prince his opinion. Presenting ideas only to find flaws in them before Natsu even said anything. The Dragon Prince bit the inside of his cheek. He told the man not half an hour ago that if he didn't do it sooner rather than later, Urza will do it for him. Jellal opened his mouth, no sound coming out, and Natsu almost laughed again. Instead, he scolded his face into a perfect emotionless mask as he leaned against the table, elbow on the table, chin on the palm. I do believe now is a good time to tell you, I told you so. Urza was probably too nervous to respond to that, if the way her entire frame was frozen yet shaking was any indication. Jellal only managed to blink at him, somehow managing to look offended in that one blink while keeping the incredulous look on his face. Utterly amused, Natsu continued, I do believe you are meant to answer her. Hopefully, before she gets a stroke. Urza did apparently register their conversation because the mage nodded rather aggressively. Jellal blinked, finally pulled out of the stupor, and rose from the chair he sat on. Natsu watched, eyebrows raising into his hairline as Jellal pulled a box of his own and knelt in front of Urza. I wanted to do this, I don't know how, but I know I wanted to ask you the same thing. Urza Scarlet, will you marry me? And now they both were kneeling there, frozen and shocked with Natsu in the middle. Depending on which angle one looked at them, it might look like they were proposing to him, Natsu mused, noting the way that the entire guild was now looking at them, no one really sure what to do or even what was going on. I am sorry to tell you this, but I am taken, Natsu finally told them, voice as dry as a desert, when no one moved. The two looked at him with enough surprise that Natsu knew they forgot he was even here. But it was enough to get them both moving. Urza jumped to her feet, Jellal close behind her, and the two closed the small gap in an instant, kissing deeply, and Natsu all but rolled his eyes at them. Took them long enough. Yes, Jellal said finally when they broke apart, and Urza sniffed, eyes watery, and she nodded as well, grinning from ear to ear. Natsu fought off his own grin, standing up from the table, intent on giving the two some semblance of privacy. As much as one could have in an overcrowded guild hall. Urza looked at him over Jellal's shoulder, mouthing a thank you as he passed behind him, and Natsu shrugged. He'd hardly done anything. He made his way to the bar. The guild, realizing what happened, had already started becoming louder. Reaching the bar, he took a seat, his back turned to the wall as Altair wordlessly pressed a glass into his hand and knocked the glass she had in her own hand in a toast. It was about time the two did this. Jellal bought that ring nearly 8 months ago, Natsu told her after a moment, a satisfied smirk on his lips when he saw Altair's eyebrows rise in surprise. What took him so long? Never was a right moment, according to him. Altair laughed at that. Of course, there wasn't. He always was one for theatrics, especially when it came to Urza. Good thing Urza finally got a ring of her own. I was on a brink of madness because of him. He wasn't sure if it was in the way he said it or if Altair just knew him well enough, but the woman was now looking fully at him, eyes open wide. You didn't. Didn't what? Tell her to do it? Natsu laughed. I did no such thing. Smirking, he continued, I just encouraged her to do it. Didn't know she'd actually do it. Altair's eyes narrowed in suspiciousness, and Natsu felt his smirk turn into a grin. He really didn't know it. But Urza had never been the one for subtlety. Nor did her patience leave much to be desired. She wanted to deny it. Couldn't get the words out. You are my sister, he continued, looking away now, and well. I just wanted you to know that I forgive you. If it is my forgiveness you even want. There were no words she could use to describe how much she wanted to hear him say that. How long she wanted to hear that. She was moving before her brain even managed to tell her it might not be the best idea, flinging herself into his arms. He sat there, frozen as she sobbed against his chest, burying her head against him. It wasn't until several seconds later that she felt his arms circle around her shoulders, pulling her closer in a tight hug. And that broke whatever control she had over herself, sobbing hard enough she had trouble getting enough air. Crying because he died, crying because no matter what she will always bear some responsibility for it, crying because of what happened to him. What happened to them? Why? She wasn't even sure what she was asking. Why what? He huffed a laugh that sounded strangled, like someone pulled it out of him with pliers, and his voice sounded hoarse as he answered, life is too short to stay angry. Present asterisk, it would be a lie if she said she didn't think about that day often. She wondered if Natsu thought of it as often as she did. Why the long face? She blinked, looking up in time to see Natsu take a seat on the opposite side of the table. She was so lost in her own thoughts she didn't hear him approach. Ah, she paused, watching as he raised an eyebrow at her, waiting for her answer, just thinking. Natsu chuckled at that. I can see that much, penny for your thoughts. She smiled at that, waving a hand through the air as she leaned back, nothing important. Really? He looked at her suspiciously, eyes narrowed like he could hear her thoughts if he tried hard enough. Natsu looked away at that moment, clearing his throat, one hand rubbing the scarred side of his face. Well, he spoke before she could say anything else, you can always talk to me if you need to. You know that. She smiled at that, nodding. She knew that, and that knowledge left her feeling warmer instantly. Natsu smiled as well, and a moment later reached into his back pocket, pulling out a slip of paper. Wendy blinked, looking at the job placed in front of her. It took her a moment to realize what he was trying to say. And the shock must have shown on her face because he smiled again. Thought you might be interested in doing a job with me. She blinked again, eyes widening before she looked around again, expecting Arthur or Altair to be around. Just the two of us, he explained, the smile turning into a smirk, and then as an afterthought he added, and the cats I guess if they are willing. She couldn't remember when was the last time this happened. Probably before he became a guild master. He rarely left to go on missions anymore, as it was rarer still he went with someone. She found herself smiling wide enough that it hurt. Give me a moment to grab my stuff, the things between them will probably never be the same. But they were good. There used to be a point in time when he couldn't stand to be in the same room as Natsu. Couldn't stand the thought of him. Now he couldn't imagine a life without him. The closest thing he will ever have to a brother. Laxus sometimes wondered when did that happen. It wasn't even really that important. He was just glad it ended up the way that it did. He smirked at the thought, amusement bubbling in his chest. And really, it could have ended very differently. At that particular line of thought, he laughed. Fried blinked from where he sat next to him, looking up at him from his drink. What's so funny? He looked at himself, self-conscious a moment later, is there something on me? And Laxus couldn't help but laugh again. Nah. Just thinking about how Natsu almost killed me back in 84. Fried blinked again at that, looking up at him like he lost his mind. I'm not sure how's that funny. Laxus shrugged, picking up his own cocktail and swirling the olive in it with the toothpick. Just where we were then and where we are now. Fried still didn't look amused. The green-haired man rolled his eyes instead and looked away for a second. He stayed serious for another long second where Laxus suddenly wondered if he said something wrong before he saw a smirk work its way on Fried's face. It is an improvement, certainly. Laxus laughed again at that, a considerable improvement. He raised his glass slightly, tipping it towards Fried's, and the man happily obliged. A soft click echoed as glass met glass. The two looked at each other, smiling. I'm shocked he didn't kill you, truth to be told, Fried said with a blink, looking down at his drink. That makes two of us, Laxus agreed easily, huffing a laugh, but if I remember correctly, I have Mira to thank for that. Fried hummed under his breath at that, taking another sip of the cocktail before glancing at Laxus with a smile, and there was something open and earnest on his face that Laxus couldn't quite place. You're right, remind me to thank her for that. Sitting in the living room of a house he grew up in never felt more awkward. Arthur could count on the fingers of one hand how many times he had a conversation with Acnologia. Which was probably why the two of them sat in complete silence now. He wasn't even sure why the Dragon King was here. Well, that wasn't entirely true. Probably the same reason he was here. Family dinner, Mira called it. A nuisance, Acnologia called it. Arthur could settle on awkward. Natsu was still in the guild and Arthur couldn't help but wonder if the man was even aware Acnologia was here. He didn't mention anything today, so Arthur was fairly certain the answer was no. Which begged the question, how did Altair and Mira get Acnologia to come? Or was it a coincidence? Are you trying to drill a hole in me, Arthur? He didn't even realize he was staring at the Dragon King and Arthur could feel his ears turning red, so he looked away quickly, a finger scratching through his beard. Ah, no, just got lost I thought is all. Acnologia was still staring at him. And there was something very weird about Acnologia, the king of dragons sitting in his living room. Was all the Dragon King said after a moment before he looked away, and Arthur was certain they will return to the awkward silence, but Altair chose that moment to appear in the doorway, blinking in shock when she spotted Acnologia. Acnologia, she did little to hide the surprise. Acnologia, Natsu must have been right behind her because he was in the doorway in the next second, eyes immediately locking with Acnologia's, and the Dragon King gave something that could have been a wave and could have been a salute. Natsu blinked, eyes snapping to Arthur in the next moment, and Arthur gave him his best, don't ask me, look. Mira came from the kitchen then, grinning, it's been a while since we all sat down together, so I called him over. Natsu blinked again, obviously not sure how to respond to that. He turned back to Acnologia, a skeptical look on his face, you came here for a dinner. Acnologia shrugged, apparently, is Igneel coming? Or is he here already? Altair asked, looking around the room, and Natsu nearly laughed at the pinched look that appeared on Acnologia's face. It's nice to see you too, Altair, the Dragon King told her with a sniff, standing up as he said it. Altair paused at that, turning to look back at Acnologia, but Natsu spoke before she could. "It's nice to see you, father." Acnologia heft, but the Dragon King moved and gave Natsu a decidedly awkward one-handed hug before he patted him on the shoulders. "Obviously. It's always nice to see me." Natsu huffed a laugh. "Yeah." His voice was dry as a desert, dripping with sarcasm. "You're a delight." "I'll pretend you actually mean that," Acnologia informed him, and the Dragon King moved to the kitchen, the rest following him. At his family, the Fantasia parade was not entirely a happy memory, but it was an important one. It almost felt like the parade was the beginning. And in a way it was. Transforming into a dragon for the first time certainly was a feeling he won't forget for as long as he was alive. And now, years later, he can see that it wasn't even the greatest thing that happened on that day. It was possibly the first time he admitted he needed them. Not out loud, barely even to himself, but he realized then that life without Fairy Tail was not possible. Life without these people was unimaginable. Because they were more than friends. More than family. It crushed him, knowing they will all die and he will not. But in moments like these, he could ignore it. He could sit back and watch as Arthur and Gray bickered about parade order. Could watch as Urza and Levy talked, Lucy in Levy's lap about family. Could laugh at the stupid joke Gajeel told Laxus and Jellal on the other side of the guild. Could smile at Wendy as their eyes met from across the guild. Could nod in respect to Makarov, who was sitting in his wheelchair not far from the bar, laughing with Asuka. Could relax at the warmth in his side from where Mira sat pressed against him and squeeze his hand around Ultir's as she leaned towards him with a kiss. They won't be here forever. He returned Ultir's kiss and looked at her frowning face in confusion. The woman's frown eased into something sorrowful as she reached out, cupping his cheek with her hand and running a thumb under his eye, and he realized with a start that there was a tear trailing down his face. He smiled at her, thankful that she didn't say anything, and squeezed her hand tighter, leaning closer himself for another kiss. His throat closed and he bit the inside of his cheek, looking away and willing away the tears. His eyes turned to the open doors of the guild and stopped, staring. Mavis stood there, bare feet on the stone floor, blonde hair moving in the unseen breeze. She was looking straight at him, a small smile on her face. The world around them came to a stop and Natsu could swear he saw a shadow of feathery wings and antlers behind her, light nearly blinding around her coming from the outside. Nothing is truly immortal. He blinked and Mavis was gone and the world was moving again and the light was gone. Ultir must have noticed he suddenly tensed, and so did Mira, because they were both looking at him with alarm, worry, and shock on their faces. It wasn't until he drew in another shaky breath that he realized he was sobbing now. Bawling really. And he should be ashamed probably. He didn't doubt he will be embarrassed later, what with the attention this was drawing. And Ultir and Mira shaking him and trying to get a response from him didn't help. But he couldn't really respond now. There were no words for it truly. There was no way he would ever be able to explain it to them. The relief nearly made him collapse. Because Mavis was right, and hadn't he said those exact same words to her all those years ago? Everything will be alright. Nothing is truly immortal and everything will be alright. He will be alive for a long time still. But he will see them. Sooner or later. Because that was the way of things. And he must be giving the people around him some serious reason to worry about his sanity, because he wasn't only crying but laughing as well. As long as he's alive he will have Fairy Tail. Because Fairy Tail was family. And when he moves on, they will be waiting for him. Fairy Tail is special. It truly was. He laughed again, breathless and ignoring every last one of the worried looks he was getting, closing his eyes, and for the first time in years, it didn't hurt to breathe. Because everything will be alright. He wanted the others to understand that. He needed them to understand. Needed to tell them how great it is. It's going to be alright, he said then, laughing, and he knew that in a way he knew the sky was blue and the sun rose in the east. Nothing is truly immortal and everything will be alright. The end. I hope you enjoyed. If you enjoyed this series, be sure to leave a like. Also check out one of the other videos on this channel. Ray What If signing off.